All right. My name is Ed Kanda, and it's my pleasure to join with all of you and to present together with Professor Nick Otero and also to have facilitation with John Coates. I always greatly enjoy being with these people, and I'm very happy to join this conference. So we're going to be presenting, co-presenting. Anthony and I will go back and forth, and we're also going to have some time for Q&A and for interactive discussion at the end. Since we're starting so late, I might need to reduce some of the Q&A time and final discussion, but we're going to see how this goes. So without further ado, I'm going to share my screen and we'll get started. Just a moment. All right, is this visible? Okay. All right. Okay, Anthony, would you like to go ahead?
Sure. Thanks so much, Ed. Again, thank you for the privilege and true, I would say, grace of being with you all. Deeply grateful for this opportunity. And it's been a privilege to partner with Ed over the last number of years together. We'll speak more about that later in the presentation, but I'm just going to briefly outline what we'll be covering. Ed and I co-teach a postmaster's level certificate course on spirituality and social work through New York University's School of Social Work. So we're going to talk some about that, sponsorship, description, design of that course, the approach we take. I'll share a little bit about a framework that I've created called the Circle of Insight, and we'll provide some examples of content on eco-spirituality. We'll also talk a bit about Mandala quilt of spiritual diversity and connection in social work. That is something that Ed covers in his text and that we actually practice together as part of the course. We'll have some time for a Q&A and some additional examples and hopefully, again, small group discussion. Thank you so much again, John. And we appreciate your patience with technology in terms of a hybrid model here. And we'll have, again, some time hopefully for a whole group discussion. I think we can move to the next slide.
Okay, I'm trying to get that to advance. All right, so professional social work ethics in the US, Canada, and international standards with IFSW and CSWE standards. They all support the importance of appropriate and competent ways to address spirituality and environmental justice in the context of intersectional diversity and cultural humility, holistic perspective. But surveys consistently are showing that educators and practitioners most of the time do not have educational preparation for addressing this. So our postmaster's level course is a valuable way to help correct this omission. It provides 36 hours of continuing education credit in 2-hour sessions that are spread across 2 semesters. And people in the USA and Canada, it's set up for get continuing education credit, but people from anywhere can participate. And by the way, enrollment is now open if you just go online looking at the NYU course on spirituality and social work. The class starts in September.
So I would add that I know some of our former students as well as presenters we bring to the program are there at the conference. I think, Ed, I can speak for you, wish we could be with you in person, but again, grateful for this opportunity to join you virtually. These are the primary texts that we use, although, again, we have speakers come in. We have a lot of kind of supplementary reading. All of the material is provided by NYU for participants free of charge, which we're grateful for. The Spirituality and Mental Health Practice Narrative Casebook, I had the privilege of contributing to that. It's a case study, a series of cases that we look at, and some of the presenters are authors from that text in addition to myself. The primary text, though, is Ed's text, Kanda, Furman Kanda, Spiritual Diversity and Social Work Practice, The Heart of Helping. I trust that everyone is familiar with that text and just have, they've added a number of cases to their text, I know, in the most recent 2020 edition. And so we go through that along with a number of the exercises. And of course, it's just an honor and privilege to have Ed helping lead us through that text. And then we also use Dudley's Spirituality Matters in Social Work. I know he may be there as well. I know he's been to the conference in the past. So we're grateful for all of the scholarship and then additional folks who join us. I know Dr. Boynton, who helped plan this conference, has contributed in the past and guest lectured for us. So that is just kind of a brief overview of some of the materials that we use in the course.
So as I mentioned, we have 18 two-hour sessions over 2 semesters. And Anthony, would you like to say more about that?
Sure. So we usually have 9 sessions in the fall and 9 sessions in the spring. And again, each is worth 2 CEs in the US, although I know they're also working to get international credit for students who might join us from Canada or other places. We're really open, which is wonderful, to students from all over the globe joining us, in as much as it's a virtual program. We have 10 to 15 practitioners, participants usually that we accept. We can probably accept up to 20. So it's a nice number. It's kind of a graduate level seminar type conversation. All participants are in social work and or allied fields, mental health fields, and have had postmaster's experience in their field clinically, usually, or in some practice capacity. Our overarching perspective, kind of we're looking at contemporary issues in spirituality and social work from micro to macro, and the importance, again, of spirituality and its diverse religious and non-religious expressions. So we do bring in presenters from various traditions. We've had Rabbi Simcha Weintraub, for example, from the Jewish faith and tradition. We've had others from Christian tradition, Buddhist, Hindu, Muslim tradition as well, present with us. And we try to think about, again, that ecological perspective of whole person, biopsychosocial, spiritual person, and environment globally and contextually.
And I'd like to add, in relation to the picture there from Lotus Pond in South Korea, the lotus is one of the symbols that runs through our work in the course, because the meaning of the lotus is very significant in regard to the human condition. It grows up out of muddy, murky water, and the leaves spread out on the surface of the pond, open to the sun, and the flowers bloom. So it's a common symbol representing the human condition of suffering, the impermanence of life, adversities of life. But out of that muddy water, we can grow, we can blossom, we can thrive, and spirituality is a very important resource for that. And also the lotus and its interdependency with water, air, sun, everything else is a good metaphor for the wholeness of everyone and everything in interdependent interconnection. A little more on description, Anthony?
Sure. And you might want to comment on the picture again as I finish. But fully, again, the course is fully online. And so, again, open globally to students as long as they can make accommodation. It meets on Tuesday evenings from 6:30 p.m. to 8:30 p.m. Eastern Standard New York time. We combine, again, didactic, interactive, collaborative, experiential methods, including self-reflection and journaling, with role-playing and narratives and storytelling, and practicing before doing, so we'll have a brief practice. I like to use the singing bowl. I might say a word about that a little bit later in the spirit of Thich Nhat Hanh, who I'll say a word about later, with whom I've had the privilege of working. But each student brings practices, as well as we share practices, engaging kind of, and again, practicing before doing, exchanging the lead role among co-instructors. So Ed and I share that along with guest presenters, as I've mentioned, and we also shift in the spirit of Paulo Freire. For those who may know Pedagogy of the Oppressed, we are all student teachers, teacher students. So the students themselves literally become the teachers in the last three sessions and lead presentations for us. Again, Ed, you might want to comment on the photo.
Well, just briefly, my wife Hija was enjoying herself in the prairie here, and one of the things that I like to do is use images, either photographs based to nature images, and you'll see them spread through the presentation today. And I think that gives kind of an implicit nonverbal way of affirming and cueing our interdependency as whole people and the whole world. So very quickly, just highlighting some of the topics, we address intersections of spirituality, mysticism, culture, and religion, relational spirituality, community well-being, and eco-justice. We explore practitioner and client spirituality and a spiritually sensitive helping relationship. We explore a variety of specific religious and non-religious spiritual practices and their connections to social work practice and social welfare. We have a strong emphasis on professional value base and guidelines for ethically appropriate engagement of spirituality. Looking also at the intersection of mind and body and holistic, integrative, artistically creative helping practices. We consider spirituality and human development across the lifespan, and also in terms of spiritual emergence, spiritual transformation, and spiritual crises. And we are highlighting as well contribution of spirituality to social change, social policy, and eco-spiritual justice. So we focus on spiritually sensitive approaches to promote wholeness and growthful transformation, including those that are nature-based, which we'll get to in a little bit.
And some of the methods we use include reflective readings, journaling, lectures, again, role playing, small group sharing, narratives and storytelling, case studies in particular, community-based experiences, meditation, mindfulness, nature connection activities, application of learning. We'll say a little bit more about that later. One thing I like to highlight here is just one of the more powerful, I think, especially in the recent cohorts or groups of students, one of the more powerful exercises, if you will, that in which we engage is each student shares a sacred or meaningful story or object with us, even virtually, and we create kind of a sacred altar, albeit virtual space together. And so each student kind of leads in sharing that sacred, meaningful object or story with us, and that helps, we hope, build beloved community as we move through this study together.
So we really feel strongly that this is not just a matter of intellectual cognitive learning, but whole person engagement and interaction in respectful group mutual support. So spiritually sensitive social eco-justice practice begins with and engages continuously our own spiritual exploration and reflections, recognizing a holistic perspective again, and acknowledging both the creative and destructive aspects of spirituality and religion. And we always keep explicit commitment to professional mission and ethical standards.
The framework that I like to use in kind of creating our course and working together with Ed is what I call a circle of insight, and I've written it up in the Journal of Social Work Education. It really is more a curation than a creation in a lot of ways. It's a see, reflect, act cyclical process. I've had the opportunity to work with restorative justice, peacemaking and healing circles, indigenous healing circle processes, worked with some civil rights activists like Diane Nash, who with John Lewis helped found the Student Nonviolent Coordinating Committee in the U.S. during the Civil Rights era, as well as a social inquiry cycle process, even a Catholic social teaching, what's called Cardinian inquiry process. All of these different traditions, even Aristotelian philosophical traditions, seem to have this similar flow or dynamic of looking deeply, reflecting critically with head, heart, empathy, intellect, and then acting in a way that moves us toward purposely deeper justice and liberation. So I use that as a framework. I created a website there, circleofinsight.org, with some resources. And so we try to, again, engage story and really listen deeply in silence, reflect critically, applying learning as we go, and then kind of living, acting in a way that moves us toward love, the kind of agapic love of Dr. King, or transformative love, or revolutionary love of Valerie Kaur. So that process here, as you can see, with the hair goes the memory for me. So I like to say I'm challenged. Obviously, I use mnemonics like you can see them there, the kind of the L's and the I's and the S's. Silent story, song, Sangha, and social justice are my S's of this kind of spiritually sensitive, ecologically sensitive social work practice. So hopefully, again, this framework is helpful to you. I'm always wanting folks to let me know if they are, if it makes sense. And a number of students have shared that you can use it on a personal level to look deeply at one's own deepest truth and desires, reflect critically in light of your core values and commitments, again, head and heart, and then think about what action in terms of relationships or commitments or work that you do in the world. And then obviously it can also be a tool used for macro practice in the work of social justice. I think we can probably move on, Ed. Thank you. And I'll just say one word about Thich Nhat Hanh. Again, had the privilege of working with him. Some of you may know of Thich Nhat Hanh. He was a Vietnamese Zen Buddhist master who recently, as he would say, continued at the age of 95, just the past year. He was nominated for the Nobel Peace Prize by the Reverend Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. They worked together to plant seeds of peace in the mud of war. And I had the opportunity to produce a film with him in collaboration with him and his community called The Five Powers Revolution. It was a mixed media animated film. We interviewed Thich Nhat Hanh and told the story of the relationship with him and Dr. King and their work for peace and justice. And again, to go back to Ed's comment about the lotus flower, Thich Nhat Hanh has a book called No Mud, No Lotus, and he talks often about this process, right, where without the mud and the dirt and the soil and the dark, there is no beautiful lotus flower. And this cycle, of course, is the cycle of life. When the lotus flower dies, it becomes nutrients for the soil. So that this notion of no mud, no lotus, and what he calls interbeing, is not just a spiritual notion, but also a scientific notion. It is no matter is neither lost nor gained in the universe. So we're all created of that same matter, that same stuff. And we inter-are. He said we should get rid of the verb to be and replace it with to interbe. It's not that we are, it's that we inter-are, because we can't exist outside of relationship one with the other. And so we're here in that sense to awaken from our illusion of separateness. And that inspires my Circle of Insight process as well. I think is consistent with that tool and that framework.
And I think a very important aspect of that is it's not only talking about interbeing with human beings, but with all beings and everything everywhere. Okay, so we have throughout the course discussion of cases, as Anthony mentioned, and I'm going to start giving some examples of how we focus on an eco-spiritual perspective. For example, I share with the students some stories about working with students and clients that engage our interconnectedness with nature. I'm going to give a very brief example of that. This scenario 12.3 from our book goes back to the 1980s when a lot of my work was with Southeast Asian refugee resettlement. And one of my MSW students was working with Cambodian youth in a support group. Over the course of their discussions and interactions, it was clear that they were all experiencing a lot of distress related to their experience of war, genocide, refugee flight, very dangerous circumstances, moving to the US, cross-cultural transition stress, some experience of racism and discrimination, their own sorting out their new sense of identity and new life. So it was clear that they wanted to create some process to help them go through a sort of post-traumatic growth. And because they were Buddhist, they worked out a ritual that included facilitation by a Cambodian Buddhist monk. And so the highlight of their ritual together was based on many kinds of stories and artworks they had developed. And they went out to a beautiful place in nature together with a monk facilitating, and they did a ceremony for healing facilitated by the monk. And then they dug a hole and they symbolically and literally planted a tree in which they could lay to rest their pains and their struggles, as well as their hopes and aspirations, and let it rest in the earth. And they planted this tree so that its new life growing out would represent not only the new life of that tree, but their new lives as forming a new kind of identity and life possibilities in the US. So that ritual was a really valuable, culturally rooted way of encouraging and stimulating, catalyzing this post-traumatic growth process for them. And it involved their recognition and appreciation for the earth and for their interconnection with nature as part of the healing process. So in the course, we talk about a variety of ways that the theme of eco-spirituality connect in relevance to social practice. For example, environmental racism, neighborhood gardens and urban food deserts, the Eden alternative, which is a kind of holistic, nature-oriented approach to residential facilities for older adults, wilderness therapy and social skills training, mindful, prayerful, meditative immersion in nature, animal and plant-assisted therapy and healing, sacred plant medicine as a component of health and mental health, global human rights connected to eco-justice and total human nature well-being, and healing enduring trauma and anxiety related to climate change and environmental degradation and destruction. We also provide connections with a variety of resources. These are just a few examples, like NESW Resources on Environmental Justice, CSWE's Committee on Environmental Justice, and the IFSW's Climate Justice Program. So we like to interweave stories from our personal and professional lives to give a sense of realness and vitality to the course material, and also to encourage students to share their own stories. And that makes this whole experience very rich and potentially transformative for us as instructors and for the students as participants. And I'll give a few examples of that. Much of my life has really been an engagement with Korean culture. My wife is Korean American. I first went to South Korea in 1976 as a Fulbright supported graduate fellow of Eastern philosophy. So one of my interests there was Korean shamanism. The first time I had a chance to meet a Korean shaman, a Korean friend of mine brought me to visit his aunt, who was a shaman. And I went to her home with my friend. She graciously welcomed us, and we sat down on the floor as customary. And she shared some tea with us. And I had in my head some kind of anthropological interview idea about the questions I was going to ask her and collecting information. At that time, my prior education was majoring in cultural anthropology. So I asked her about her practice as a shaman, and if she would give me some examples and such. And she stopped me and she said, before I answer your questions and talk with you about this, I have a question for you. When you are walking in the mountains here in Korea, what do you feel? What do you experience? And that really actually startled me. It completely flipped me out of a cognitive head stuck space. And I had to reflect on myself and get very real and connect with her in a more personal and mutually empathetic manner. And so I told her, well, at that time, I hadn't been in Korea for a long time. So I was just coming to become familiar with the Korean mountains, which I really have come to love deeply. But I told her how I feel when I walk in the woods in where I grew up. I spent a great amount of time walking in the forests of northern Ohio near my home, and developed a sense of real intimacy and deep engagements and loving connection. And so I talked to her about that, told her some stories about that, and she said, all right, okay, now we can talk. So that to me was a really important lesson, that especially when we're engaging, learning about our interbeing, our interconnectedness with nature, that it's not just stuck in the head, it's not just ideas, it's not just theory, it's not just talk, and especially where that has to do with spirituality and genuinely connecting in a respectful learning mode across cultures and traditions. So I wanted to give another story about my connection with Korean mountains. One of my favorite places to visit is called Ma'i Mountain. Ma'i means horse's ears mountain, because as you can see from the picture in the lower right, from a distance, two main peaks look like horse's ears coming up from the earth. And there was a monk, a Buddhist monk, who lived there in the late 1800s, early 1900s as a hermit. He felt called by the mountain spirit to go find a place shaped like horse's ears. So he found this place, and he lived there for a long time. And during that time, he built natural stone pagodas. You can see some in the left picture there. Some of them are column shaped, many are cone shaped, and they could be very tall, as you can get a sense from comparing to the height of my wife Hija there. And these have no cement, no mortar, they're just balanced. This is actually a common tradition in Korea. You see many places, especially in the mountains, in your temples, where there are small or large stone pagodas that are built like this. This area for me is deeply healing, actually. I've literally experienced physical healing, walking through the valley there, really getting in touch with the earth energy and letting it work, do its healing work inside. And that has also, relating to a place in that way, is transformative. And it involves a relationship of loving interconnection with the place. It's not a matter of just using a connection with a place to exploit for some sort of personal or economic or technological advantages, but it's a genuine relationship that builds and develops over time and is transformative. I often took students on study abroad trips to this place. And so as we walk through the valley and visit shamanic sites and Buddhist temples and beautiful earth energy places, they would often experience and recount how they were deeply moved and transformed through those encounters. So I mentioned that this is not just a cognitive intellectual approach, but there is a cognitive component. I think it's helpful to connect up with theory bases that are more or less familiar in social work, to link to our person-environment perspective and frequent use of systems theories, but to do it in a way that really highlights this holistic interbeing perspective. So many times we teach about systems theory approaches, but some of them are quite reductionistic and mechanistic and really homeostatic and somewhat conservative in orientation. So I prefer to use dynamic systems theory. We're looking at the transactive mutual influence of all systems and continuous flux, and how development can be transformative, how that can be facilitated in social work, and to look at ideals of dynamic harmony, not simply system maintenance, but harmonious transformation, and seeking win-win solutions with and for all beings. And then we connect that to all of the practice relevancy themes I mentioned earlier. It also is very helpful for me to link dynamic systems to eco-philosophy, envisioning the planet and beyond as system. And I want to give a shout out to John Coates and to Fred Vesthorn, two people who have been very significant and early promoters and advocates for this perspective. So I'm really happy to have John Coates here. If you look up their names on ResearchGate, you can find access to some of their materials as examples. I'm not going to say a lot about the social action methodology, but it fits really nicely with what Anthony already explained to you. I'm going to go on to some other examples here for the sake of time. So one of the exercises, as Anthony mentioned, we do in the course, and I do with all of my courses on spirituality and social work, is to co-create a quilt or mandala of spiritual diversity and connection. So in this exercise, the group develops a kind of artistic ritual where each person creates a piece, designs a piece, either physically with paper or electronically online. Each piece represents that person's own sense of their spiritual significance, what they got as main insights through the course. It can represent words, images, colors, designs, anything they want. And then all of those pieces are assembled together into a coherent, harmonious composition. This is weird how that is flipping. Like it really wants to get to the next slide here. So I'm going to, without further ado, show you an example of how Anthony put these all together for our recent course. So I point out that naturally, spontaneously, these themes of interbeing, interconnectedness, nature, complete interconnectedness emerged in many of these designs, and that's typical with these mandala quilts. Since we started so late, I'm going to consolidate the question and response period. So I'm sorry about that, but I want to be sure we have time for some breakout discussion and then question and answer discussion at the end. So this is another example. Now moving beyond the course to other teaching settings. I was director of our doctoral program for about 8 years, and I taught doctoral courses often. These are usually small class sizes. Many times I would have our class, which would be focused on theories of human behavior at the doctoral level, meet at my home. At that time, this was the meditation pond and garden in our backyard that I and others co-created. So we would sit around a table together in a very comfortable and significant connected way with each other, but also with a large window that looked out onto the scene. And it really helped to set a tone for a deep, mutually respectful, empathetic connection. And we would also spend time out there quietly walking and meditating as appropriate for students. I wanted to share a story here that I often would use in classes to connect with the Taoistic change, which is a term that Maslow actually coined a long time ago from his interest in the Chinese philosophy of Taoism. This has to do with the notion of promoting positive and growthful change in a way that is harmonious with the situation and all of the people involved, seeking mutual benefit rather than adversarial winning of one party over another. So, you know, when I had a friend who was really had the technical expertise to make such a well-designed pond and terracing. And when he was working on that, and I was out there building these stone pagodas along the tradition that I mentioned to you before, sometimes neighbors would wander over and they're looking at what's going on. Sometimes even people would show up, strangers. I didn't even know who they were. They heard about it somehow and they're wandering around in the backyard. And I didn't mind, but I was also a little concerned that sometimes neighborhood kids would come over and explore, and I was concerned if anyone fell in the pond. So my wife and I were trying to think about how do we do this? Do we want to put up a complete fence barrier and block everyone out? And we thought, no, that's not good. There was already some fencing around part of it, but we wanted to still get a feeling of openness to our neighbors and the neighborhood. So instead of trying to create some kind of fixed barrier or make people feel put off and put out, we decided to have a garden party. So when it was pretty well complete, we put flyers all around the neighborhood and also invited other people who would be interested. And we said, come on over for tea and desserts, and we're just going to hang out there and chat. And so instead of closing it down, we actually totally opened it up. And many people came, and including kids, and they had fun running around, and the parents and neighbors, we were all chatting, having a great time. And they all had satisfied their curiosity. And after we finished the party, nobody ever came and intruded on the space again. So that was a way of finding a solution that was inviting and opening and flowing with the curiosity of the neighborhood, not alienating or closing off. And so that's I think a metaphor for how we can engage in therapeutic and social change in a way that is non-adversarial. I also often have students do a reflective walking if say we're having a class on campus. And so first they've learned some simple mindfulness practices in the class. And then I asked them to take about 20 minutes to walk outside just nearby and not talk, not engage in their cell phones and not get distracted, just pay attention to themselves in the moment, wander as they feel moved to wander, and pay attention with all their senses. And then to perceive with an open, fresh mind. And I ask them to find at least one thing that's new to them. And at first they may wonder, well, what do you mean? We've walked around here many, many times because we're students in this campus. But I ask to perceive with a fresh, open mind and just come on back. And then we talk about what people found. And that simple exercise, many people have found really valuable because they get unstuck from their technology and their internal distractions. They experience a very familiar place, but in a new, fresh way. And maybe it's a flower that they encountered, or an insect, or maybe it's the sound of the wind in the trees, or feeling the wind on their skin. Maybe it's noticing trash that people have left and considering what they might do to clean up that trash. Maybe it's spurs some ideas for what they can do to actually contribute to enhancing the natural environment of the campus. Another thing that I do to help link theory to personal and professional growth is a mandala of theory-inspired growth goals and actions. So just to give you the highlight of what this is, they can do it physically or electronically. I provide them with a mandala template or let them design however they want with domains of life relating to biological, social, psychological, spiritual, and the interconnection, the integration of all of that, as well as the social environmental context and planetary ecological context. So they identify some insight they got from any relevant theory throughout the semester, and they write that theory name down, and then they identify a goal for their personal and or professional growth that they get out of insight from that theory. For example, on the left, the planetary ecological context, the student identified deep ecology as the relevant theory. And then with each of that, they specify for the growth goal a specific action, a specific doable action they'll commit to. The mandala on the right was created without a template, a more creative artistic project, and it also included explanatory attachments like we have with the words on the left mandala. So what this does for students is they can link their insights from theory and knowledge base to what it means for how they want to grow and change as persons and as professionals. And it's very holistic in its orientation. So for the sake of time, I'll just give a couple of other examples quickly. So on this one, students learn to do a kind of human service organizational analysis. And that always includes a component of looking at the agency's engagement and impact on the social and natural environment, like doing an energy audit, examining individual organized sustainability actions, specific clinical practices that might be relevant, and the impact on the local community and natural environment with community-based participatory research. And based on the analysis, they can generate proposals for enhancing, expanding, and innovating in their the environmental engagement and impact of the agency. In my area, we have Haskell Indian Nations University in my town. There's a lot of interaction and collaboration between KU and Haskell. That provides a lot of good opportunities as well for education. So I like to promote raising awareness of environmental justice action in connection with First Nations, Indigenous justice, decolonizing, and mindfulness. Just a couple of sources for that. I highly recommend the work of Dean Michael Yellowbird from University of Manitoba, who's a longtime friend. All of his work is really, I find, very impressive, and you can find much of it just through Google searching, including many YouTube videos. He does a lot about linking mindfulness and decolonization and Indigenous justice and sovereignty issues. You also know that Timothy Leduc there is one of the presenters, and recently I got to be acquainted with him, and I've been recommending his work. So in our ground at Haskell Indian Nations University, there is a medicine wheel, which is an earth sculpture. It's the prairie grass in one area is mowed in a way that creates the medicine wheel pattern you can see on the right there. And the medicine wheel is sacred ground. So it's a place that people should only in a manner of respect with a sense of prayer and humility. So the sign there conveys that. I often include Haskell faculty guest speakers, and often combined Haskell and KU human behavior class meetings. So we would all meet together and learn from each other. Often we have presentations around links between holistic thinking and medicine wheel teachings. Sometimes we have guided student visits to the medicine wheel, and that's always guided by friends and colleagues of mine who are Indigenous and connected with Haskell. We also may have students doing projects that investigate specific issues connecting Indigenous peoples and social environmental justice. For example, we had a conflict for decades that went around building a new expressway, traffic way through lands that impinged on waterways, protected waterways, and also land for Haskell Indian Nations University. And so students have sometimes, when that was still going on, doing a detailed analysis of who were all of the interest groups involved, pro and con the traffic way, and how to sort out ways of getting involved in a proactive and supportive way to promote environmental justice, sovereignty, and cultural respect. All right, I feel like I've gone really quickly. I'm sorry if it was too quick, but what I would like to do is have about 10 to 15 minutes of small group discussions. Let me check. I'm not sure how many people we have online, but I don't think it's many. So for the online group, do you see, Anthony, how many we've got online?
10. It looks like 10 people.
All right, maybe it's sufficient for us to all discuss together online. For the people who are in person, I'm gratefully asking John Coates to break participants into small groups if there's enough people there. Right now, I can't see how many are there. And I'd like to ask each group, if you are in separate groups, to select a spokesperson. For this discussion, I hope that what Anthony and I presented have just stimulated some ideas and possibilities for you, but you also, I'm sure, are doing many important and valuable and inspiring things along these lines. So I thought it would be good to take a little time. Let's shoot for 10 minutes due to the lateness, to interact with each other, ask questions, give suggestions and examples, talk about what you're doing, and then have a report back to the full group. So John, if you wouldn't mind facilitating some small group discussion there for 10 minutes, and Anthony and I will do that with our group.
Will do.
Thank you. So I'm going to stop my share.
And I don't know if we want to enter another room. We can probably just stay in this room, but I know that they may be hearing us then if we're talking. I don't. So I could create a breakout room. We would all join just one breakout room, and I think that would solve the problem.
Yes, that would work.
Okay.
Are you able to do that, Anthony? Or
Yes.
yes, Rochelle do it. Okay.
I'll try. You should be getting a.
Where would we start, Ed?
All right. I wondered maybe we could start, John, if you have a few comments, questions that came out of your small group discussion.
Well, the one that came out of the small group I was involved in suggested that maybe folks in Canada could develop a course similar or modeled after the one you have, but engaging universities across the or more of the profs of us who are interested in.
Your voice is cutting in and out.
Similar, but based on a Canadian context and the local realities of some of the folks who would be taking such a course.
Yeah, that's a great idea. Is there a plan? Maybe you all could talk about how to actually jumpstart that.
Well, we thought about jumpstarting it through the society,
Good.
but the challenge there is to get accreditation within a particular program or university, because that would give us a little more credibility, because there's a value to having a university credit as opposed to just a certificate from the society.
Yeah.
Your thoughts on that one?
Well, maybe even one way to start or contribute to that process is I'm pretty sure from hearing from the continuing ed administrator at New York University that our course is already set up to include the possibility of Canadian participants and to be eligible for this certificate through our program through NYU. If anybody would like to join us, you would be very welcome, and that might also be an opportunity where people could think through how to generate something specifically Canada-based. And if there was any question about that, about how to sign up for that, you could always let us know, and we can make sure you're connected with the administrator for the continuing ed program.
Some of our listeners here might be quite keen to do that.
Oh, cool. That would be excellent.
Sandra, do you want to comment on your group or someone?
We had a great small group discussion here. We listened to Aaron Burgess's experience of recently having finished the program. And
Nice.
so, through his stories of the program and what it just sounds like a marvelous experience, very intimate, personal, connected, really quite lovely. So happy to have heard that, Aaron. So I think maybe, do you want to say just maybe one of the pieces that?
Hello, everybody online as well. I was asked what was it like to take it online? And I can just briefly say, you're not able to recreate the in-person experience through Zoom. That said, one of the things I was concerned about was I live in Alabama. Out of 10 people, 5 of the students were in New York. So I didn't know how I was going to be able to connect. And so the sharing of the sacred object, which kind of then morphed into sacred experience each week, allowed us to really get to know each other in a profound way and help to build trust and connectiveness between us. So at the end, when we did our presentations of what our own areas of interest were, we were really able to feel like we knew each other and see each other's interests, not as just like content knowledge that might have been interesting, but really we were really able to get to know each other and grow together in that way. Ed and Anthony were really great about being able to foster and build that connection in the online space.
I just I had a quick question, and I'm aware of the time, but just maybe an idea too. I really liked the exercise as it was described. the sacred object, and we don't have, so it sounds like your program is it's a dedicated program, and it sounds like there may be a greater ease at building the trust and intimacy. Where I teach social work, we don't have a core course. It's not in our core curriculum. And so when we teach it, it often gets, as here said, sometimes you sneak it in or you develop a module within a larger core course. I've taught it over the years as an independent study. So the students who are in those small independent study groups want to be there. So that's an easier space to do an exercise like the sacred object. But I'm just trying to think, I would love to do that in a core course. So the theoretical foundations, or when I'm doing the spirituality piece in a core course, and incorporate an exercise like that. I'll soon be teaching a course on animal society and social work, and I would like to do it there. And my question, I guess, is just how do you get the buy-in from within the core course context, because everyone is so busy and the schedule, the curriculum schedule is so intensive in the regular program. And sometimes when you ask students to slow down and do maybe a postural meditation for 5 minutes at the top of class, it's not that people don't want to do it, but it's just we're in this rush all the time. And it's trying to get to propose it in a way that you can convince the students that this is a good thing to do.
Maybe I'll briefly comment that, of course, we have, besides this NYU course, for decades, I taught a MSW elective course on spirituality and social work. So that, as you indicated, people are there because they want to, usually, and we can build a relationship. We can build a rationale and a comfort level for doing many things, including experiential activities. But I've also always incorporated spirituality, you might say, as modules within all of my courses, which were usually human behavior and qualitative research oriented. And so because students are coming from a lot of different backgrounds and comfort levels around it, I will try to introduce it in a way that fits their priorities and interests. One way is if we're covering theories related to spirituality, such as transpersonal theories, or even aspects of social constructionism, and when we're talking also about a variety of cultural and philosophical perspectives, where there's a natural fit or a segue, I will often introduce some experiential activity around that. And usually what I found is that students like it so much that they want to continue doing something. I also would usually have a quiet moment in the beginning of a class, and I explain it the first day when I'm explaining about the class. I don't frame it as meditation, even at first, just simple moment of quiet. And usually students' response is so positive, they want to keep it going. And then if I get that kind of receptivity, we can introduce some more elaborate activities around mindfulness and meditation. But I'm always really careful to make sure students know that I'm coming from a framework grounded in professional ethics, and try to model the same thing we would say working with clients, that it has to fit interest, comfort level, and our own skills and qualifications to do such a thing. Anthony, do you have a comment? And then I'm going to see if somebody from our online group, we can take a couple extra minutes if people don't mind.
Sure. I just have three very quick things. One, Aaron, it's so nice to hear your voice, and I only wish I could be there. I know Ed and I wish we could be there with you in person. Thank you for sharing, and thank you for your engagement in our course. And I do think, it is a work to some degree, one might say, of the spirit, or just the community that comes together in terms of the engagement. And we just have had really wonderful students who've been really engaged. And as Ed said, they do choose to be there. I would say in terms of programs funding, you know, in the US, at least, the Templeton Foundation has been giving funding to help develop courses that can be integrated into current curricula. So I believe that would be, but I'm not sure. Holly Oxhandler, I know Ed knows a lot about this, and probably some of you there know about this. And that would be something that sometimes can be persuasive to institutions. If you come with funding, you can get that funding, you can get things integrated practically into a course. And the last thought I had was, thank you, Ed, again, for all the effort to make much of, if not most of your work open source. And we're happy to share our syllabus if it would be helpful. You know, I put a link in the chat to our course, but share our syllabus. And Ed has been incredibly generous with sharing his work and resources to help build or grow a Canadian program. We want to see, obviously, as much as possible. Join us at NYU, but if that's doesn't make sense, please, you know, if we can be helpful in providing resources or support to you in starting your courses or program, we would love to do that.
I also wanted to quickly share something I did with the online group, that if you go to my Spiritual Diversity Initiative website or ResearchGate, you can find, as Anthony mentioned, open access materials. One of those is a booklet on guidelines for teaching about spirituality and social work as independent course, like we have a syllabus, and also modules, and also suggestions for how to advocate for this kind of thing in programs. So from our online group, if we can go a couple more minutes.
A couple of more minutes, Ed, because we have.
Yeah. All right, great. Thank you. Anthony, would you want to share something related to our online group discussion?
I was just grateful I tried to be just a listener. We had some interest in, you know, this work in high schools with high school students and exploring kind of practically the natural world and eco kind of spiritual practice in a school system that may or may not be open to that integration of spirituality and social work. And I know in the States, it's a kind of a separation of church and state, but I did reference implicit versus explicit, you know, either assessment or practice, where we might be able to get at. Hopefully the Circle of Insight, again, might be helpful. Other tools that Ed has presented could be helpful in getting at some of this practice, even if it's not explicit. And also we had Pius was sharing he's getting a program started at Indiana University School of Social Work. And I was, again, just encouraged and inspired by his commitment. And it sounds like, again, we were trying to offer, again, our tools, resources as much as possible to support that effort there. It sounds like others are doing the same. And then we had a question about mindful spiritual environments from Holly, who was just asking about how we create that context in that space. And again, what Aaron mentioned earlier and what I mentioned, and we talked a little bit about, is this creating sacred space, even virtually, by having participants kind of, in the best sense of being a kid, show and tell something that is meaningful or sacred, a story, something personal that helps create that space. Ed mentioned things like mindful walking and kind of environmental, eco-spiritual practices and exercises as well that he integrates into courses. I think that's all I'll say now, just from but others from our group, please jump in, or Ed.
Yes, we have maybe 1 minute if anybody would like to jump in from our online group.
If I may.
Sure.
Okay. I'm going to thank you all for the session. I would love to go on, and it was most interesting to hear about the program, how your content, your approaches, the inspired experiences that led to the program. So again, thank you very much. At this time, we will close the session. Thank you. And those of you online, we have the next session starts at 2:45. So we're going to take the next few minutes to set the next speakers up. That session is called Spirituality and Practice. We have 4 guests, and they will also be live, like part of the virtual experience. So if you're online, and you please stay for the next session,
which is called the children's services for making sure that children are safe in their home environments. But the place that I worked the longest and loved the most was I worked as a manager for the home care department, and that connected me with older adults. And in that time, I started to work with older adults, and I noticed that there were some concerns with people in my neighborhood and in my community, the African American population. There's a lot of substance use, and there was an area that was not talked about very often. So I felt that there was a need for me to connect with this population, to connect with their families and friends, to help people live the best sustainable lives they possibly could. And in doing that, I tried to go back to what works for African Americans, what has worked in the past, to help them with resiliency and to recover from trauma and pain and agony, which is often caused by racism, but also it surfaces during the recovery process. And I thought about what worked in my own life and what worked in my own family, which was actually, yeah, I'm trying to, anybody can help? I'm sorry, I'm trying to move the slide. Somebody's gonna help me, sorry. What you do. Oh, okay. Thank you. So what worked the most and what was most successful for this population was spirituality and at times religion, which are two different things, of course. And if we didn't learn anything this week, we learned that these are two very different things. Religion has been used throughout the African American experience as a calming, soothing mechanism to help people in times of trouble, to understand that what's going on around them may not feel like it's in their realm of problem solving abilities, but to know that there's a greater, higher power and someone who can, that is above all of us, who can protect us, who can hear us, and who can comfort us, and a place to feel that you can be forgiven for a lot of your sins and a lot of your problems that you might have caused yourself, and that you can move on with a happy life. And people have used that throughout the years. So I tried to find out through my research, does spirituality actually help people? And that's what I wanted to connect with. So the purpose of my study was to have spirituality assessed as an intervention, to have a connection and an impact of spirituality on the use of substances, and to think about the importance of engaging older adults in their community safely, keeping them in their community by using techniques that work already and are very much available to them. Because you'll see in the future, and shortly we'll talk about barriers to success and barriers to receiving treatment in the recovery field. So we want to find tapped into places in the community that they may be able to receive these services. And then creating best practices for substance use field and community-based organizations that work within these communities, and even religious organizations, to make them understand through listening to the problems and the concerns of this population, what works best for them. So letting the people have a voice. When I conducted my literature review, 3 things rose up. OAA, you will see me refer to throughout this conversation. OAA is older African Americans. So 3 themes came out of my literature review when I searched the current literature. OAAs have substance use practices, and it talks about what kind of practices this may be. In New York City, a lot of times the practices of substance use would be cigarettes, alcohol, marijuana, and often cocaine, crack cocaine in this population. Barriers to recovery was another theme that came up, which are the problems that occur when you are trying to reach out for help and support. Some of that comes from stigma and shame and guilt, which could be because of their age and because of where they're at in their families. Like, I'm the head of my family, like, how can I talk to anybody about abusing alcohol and not being in control of my life. So the stigma that's attached to the shame and guilt often stops people from seeking out successful recovery treatments. And then the role of spirituality in the recovery process. And this is a very, very shaky and a very, very complex situation because it has a couple of things that come up with this. One, how do you define spirituality? That's one of the first things, because a lot of the participants that I worked with and that I listened to, they interacted religion with spirituality. So we had to get down to the actual thoughts of what is spirituality versus what is religion. Then we had to talk about the availability of spirituality. It's something that you can contact and you can connect with on your own. So it's empowering versus religiosity, where you may only be able to attend on a Sunday in the morning for a service. And then the bigger the churches are, especially in New York City, the large mega churches that exist, you don't often have a direct connection with your pastor or be able to speak to someone about your personal problems. So the theoretical frameworks that I surrounded my research around were critical race theory. I used critical race theory because of its connection with post-traumatic slave syndrome. Post-traumatic slave syndrome was the more important theory, for lack of a better word, to bring to surface, because it showed the generational trauma and the connected trauma that African Americans have experienced from slavery time to present, as it relates to, I guess you could say, structural racism, racism as it plays out on a day-to-day basis in education, in our institutions, and the overwhelmingness that people have to deal with on a day-to-day basis that continues the trauma that people experience. This leads us to alcohol dependency syndrome, because it is alcohol sometimes it's a legal substance, so it's often accepted, and in the actual dependence can really creep up on you. It is culturally accepted and it has become a way of life. For a long time, African Americans would work hard all week, and then Friday night and Saturday night became times to connect with each other. That was done through food, sharing. These were cultural experiences and practices, and often alcohol use may have been involved, which may cause it to become a normal space for people, but it can definitely become out of control. So that's why I utilize this framework. And then we have the stages, James Fowler stages of faith. And this is very closely connected to Eric Erickson's stages of faith. However, stages of development. However, with the stages of faith, it shows that you can be at different levels of your spiritual belief system. So we have our infancy stages, where you feel that God is a big giant monster, and he will get you if you do wrong, and then we grow older and we learn that God can be something that's inside of us, someone who we can connect with, one that we can channel when we need. He hears us, he's omnipresent, he's there for us, he loves us, he does not do things to harm us or hurt us. So the Fowler stages of faith shows a gradual understanding of your faith and your well-being as it relates to spirituality and religion. The people in my participation were older African-American people, 65 or older. They all resided in New York City. They had to have used substances for at least 1 year, and they had to have been in recovery for at least 1 year. The methodology study design I used was qualitative, a pharmacological, Heurnius, and IPA technique, which I allowed the person to speak for themselves, and I allowed what they were presenting to me to be their interpretation of their experience. So it doesn't matter what I feel about spirituality and how I connect. It is and whether it would help with recovery. The purpose here was to hear from each individual how they experienced their recovery process, how they utilized spirituality or did not, and was it successful to them or not. And sometimes that's hard to do, to take your own bias out, to stand to the side and allow the people to speak, whether it's to your understanding or not. But it was a great and rewarding experience for me to allow people to help them understand how they perceived their life, how they perceived their recovery, and what they wanted to share with other people who may be coming through the same doors that they went through as it relates to recovery. I used open-ended, semi-structured questions. I use Zoom, phone, and in-person interviews. It was up to the person what they wanted to do, what was most comfortable for them. Remember, we were coming from a post-COVID experience. I started this work while COVID was still going on, and it ended after COVID was over. But still, because this is an older population, they were very reserved and being face to face, and did not really want to share the space, so to speak. So we had the problem of trying to use Zoom. And a lot of people, as you can see, even myself, I have some challenges with technology. So I can understand that my older population also had those challenges. Some of them were very uncomfortable with talking in front of family members, because you'll see when I express who actually participated, some people's families didn't know that they had these recovery issues and that they had spent time with substance use issues. This is years after, and they had lived a happy, fruitful life, and their family members didn't know about that, so they wanted to keep that to themselves, and I understood that. For my thematic analysis, I used Kirkos, first, second, and third coding, and I also broke it down into themes and sub-themes, and I'm gonna very quickly move through. So the demographics of my participants, the ages ranged from 65 to 90 years old, with an average of 70 years of age was most of my participants. It was 15 people. The years in recovery ranged from 15 years to 53 years. I had a 90-year-old participant who had 53 years clean of recovery, which was so magnificent and wonderful to hear. And that was an average of 35 years. And in education and religion, I had people who ranged from having a high school as their highest form of education, which was mostly the older participants. I had one person with 2 master's degrees. And then I had people who were Baptist, Methodist, Pentecostal, Lutheran, and I had 3 people who were who claimed no affiliation with any religious connections. The main themes that came out of my research was perception of spirituality across the recovery process. Participants also spoke about the spirituality practices that changed across the recovery process, and the spirituality improves recovery efficacy. Aging on Erickson stages, that surfaced, where people are, how people become stagnated during the time of their substance use versus people becoming, they should have been at one stage of intimacy and isolation. That's where they were when they actually should have been in the stage 8 of integrity versus despair. So that surfaced in our conversations of how people felt about themselves and where they were and their levels of life. Again, I spoke about fallow stages of faith. People were in one stage of conjunctive faith, but they were actually in stage 3, meaning that some people really did not want to talk about spirituality or religion because they felt they were in that stage where they thought that God was mad at them. At the beginning of their recovery stage, they didn't want to use spirituality in any form of their recovery. And this has been also shown throughout the literature to be true of even AA and NA, because AA does use spirituality as a means of connection with their population, but they're very strategic and they are very, very intentional about not bringing up words like God, right, or religion. They say that we give ourselves up to a higher being. We know that there's a higher spirit. So there is something that's higher than us that we can give this problem to. We don't have to solve it on our own. And it releases the person from the pressures of the right and wrong in the day-to-day of substance use problems. And then alcohol dependency theory. It wasn't a factor in this study. That was a shocker to me. I came in saying alcohol dependency is going to be a big theory in this study. It absolutely was not a study theory. Why? Because when I talked to my participants and I listened to how they perceived what they were going through, I found out that these are all people who had been almost 35 years plus in recovery. 35 years. So when I spoke to my participants about wanting to use alcohol or what was they doing to keep themselves from having a need for substance use of any kind, they were saying, are you kidding me? I'm 70 years old. I'm not doing anything to hurt myself. I can't do those things I used to do in the past. I don't have those urges anymore. So I found out through speaking to my participants that at a certain age, there's a certain form of maturity. And when you've removed yourself from this substance use for such a long period of time, that it's really not as important at this stage of life. What they want to do is live as healthy as they can and spend as much time as they can with their family and loved ones. And then the fourth one is PTSS, post-traumatic slave syndrome. It developed a sense of passiveness. That's what was coming from the research. People did not want to talk about it. They said that, racism to them is such a big problem in New York City. It's such a big problem throughout the time of their lives that they just try not to focus on it. A lot of them utilize the actual the prayer where you oh gosh, it's just eluding my mind. Where it's the prayer where you ask God, serenity prayer, I'm sorry, where you ask God to give you the courage to change the things you can. Yes, the courage to accept the things that you cannot and the wisdom to know the difference. Thank you so much. So a lot of people would bring that prayer up when I asked them about spirituality and how they deal with racism, how they deal with the different things that they're going through in their older age, aging. And that's what they connected to. There's some things that I just can't do anything about. And there's some things that I definitely know that I can make an effort and do something. And when I can, I will do that. So they leaned on talking to younger adults. That's what most of my participants wanted to do when I asked them, what would you do right now to help other people who may be in the same situation you are? They said we need to start with the youth. We need to start with younger people. We need to make sure they have activities. We need to make sure that they have programs. They said that these are the things that were missing when they were coming up, which caused them to have to be in the streets and making negative choices in their lives. So families and social support systems was very important. Looking ahead, talking to the youth, making sure that people know that they have opportunities out there and that they don't have to just follow the lead of other negative people that are in their communities. They talked about being in minority communities, being in one-parent homes when they were young. They talked about, mom wasn't necessarily not doing her job. Mom, in fact, might have been doing 3 jobs. So mom's not in the home. Mom is away working. Older siblings are expected to take care of younger siblings. And that's when some of the mischief started. And they talked about introspecting and looking into themselves and thinking about the people that they've hurt. They dealt with regret and remorse. They talked about the barriers of not being able to have access to places, or some social workers would say things to them such as, okay, you have this substance use problem. Why don't you just quit your job, go into this 2-year facility and get your life all better? Well, a lot of people cannot just quit their job. A lot of people cannot give up their children. I mean, who's going to take my children while I go away to a 2-year program? What's going to happen to my apartment? So I'm gonna come home, I'm not gonna have my children, I'm not gonna have a job, and I have no place to live. I have a whole new set of problems. Is that the layout to keep someone from sustaining in recovery? I don't think so. So these are the realistic problems that people have had to encounter. And again, like I said, shame and guilt. One of my participants said, listen, I work for the police department. I don't want to go to AA. I'm scared. I might see somebody who knows me and they know that I work for the police department. What am I supposed to do? So we have to find new and challenging ways to be able to help people engage in substance treatment without altering their life that they currently have. And then I just wanted to say, speak on these last two, perception of aging. A lot of my participants talked a lot about isolation, fear and death and dying, not wanting to be a burden on their children. These are some of the topics that came up that they said were most important to them, that they worry the most about. And it helped me to understand that people do experience these things. They don't always verbalize it, but they think it. And we need to encourage social workers, educators, family members to take into consideration that people they have a lot of pride and they do not want to become a burden. Their biggest fear is, what do I do when I can't do it anymore? And that's where we have to try to meet people at. So I just want to come down. I wanted to just really quickly, I just wanted to go over a couple of daily affirmations. This organically came from my research, and this is what some of the participants spoke about. One said, see the beauty of this world. It outweighs the ugliness, right? This gentleman, he was, I think about in his 80s. Ava said, bring your body and your mind will follow, right? And then I like this. Gwen said, relapse can be a strength. Just get up and try again. So some people get stuck when you may relapse or you may have a problem and they just give up and I just can't do it. This young lady said, it's okay. Relapse is part of the cycle. It's part of the process. You learn things. I mean, we don't want you to relapse, but if you do, you learn things from it and you can get better. And then I had this Georgie, this is my 90-year-old person. He says he always remember KISS, KISS. Keep it simple, stupid. He said, long as you keep it simple, everything will be right. Don't overthink things. So these are just some of the sayings that my participants have brought up, and I'm just trying to wrap up. Some implications here. Spirituality is critical component for recovery. All right, because recovery changes spiritual perceptions and practices. So it's very important. And if you're doing work with other populations that you are not familiar with, find out about them, do a little research, or just do like I did, ask questions, ask people what they like, ask what makes them comfortable, ask them what they would like to see or what they don't see in their communities. And I think it's very important also to just add on here, because I do teach for a living, that it's important to see this work being done in undergrad, master's level, and PhD programs. We have to connect. We have to have these conversations. We have to have the representation in the literature also. I want to thank you for your time. I'm sorry I kind of rushed through, but I appreciate you. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Joyce. Let's just see if there are any questions. Maybe we'll keep it to about 2 or 3 minutes.
Through your research, what did you come out with as a form of resource for these older African Americans who are really addicted to substance use or through other alcohol, which only have the single resource through the church? What other resources are available for them to be able to mitigate through some of these barriers that you talked about?
where they usually are. So I would have conversations with the parishioners and the people in the church that work with the older adults and let them know that this is a topic that they want to talk about. This is a topic they need to talk about. So speak directly to the people within the church community so that they know that this is something that they need to start bringing up. Another way is to go to senior centers. In New York City, we have a lot of senior centers. We have places where you can go on Zoom or you can go in person. And I always often recommend that my seniors that my staff work with would go out and they would work with making sure that we do like a questionnaire and a survey and speak to people about depressions, but also, isolation, but we also add in there now substance use. We also add in there financial problems because people are often subject at that age to some type of financial thievery. So we bring up questions about substance use and your finances also, just to try to open up the dialogue and a conversation. But a lot of these participants asked if we can have focus groups. They want to sit around with each other, right? They don't want people to just listen to them. They want to talk to each other. And in that way, I think that in focus groups, when people are sitting around talking together, you can get more conversation going and get more problem solving done. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Joyce.
If you need to.
All right. So thanks again, Joyce. And let's move on to our next presentation, which is the integration of ecological awareness and spiritual interventions in social work. And we have two presenters. So we have Tyler Swafford, who is a third-year PhD candidate at the Indiana University School of Social Work. And his research uplifts minority communities. And then we have Pius online. Tyler?
Yes.
Yes.
Yes, I'm here.
Hi, Pius.
Hi.
So we have Pius Malia Belyan. I hope I said that right.
Yes.
Thank you. Is a third-year PhD student at the Indiana University School of Social Work. And his research interconnects spirituality and spiritual healing, holistic wellness, as well as religion. So let's welcome Tyon and Pius.
Thank you. Good afternoon, everybody that's here, that is on the Zoom. I'm so happy to be here today. I was sharing with a couple of my peers here that this is the first time I've ever been out of the United States. So I'm excited. And this fell off. So, but I'm very excited to be here, and I'm excited to share about a topic that's meaningful for me and for my colleague Pius as well. So today we're going to be talking about the integration of ecological awareness and spiritual interventions in social work. And this is a topic that is very near and dear to both of our hearts, professionally and personally. And to do that, we're going to cover the following objectives during our time today. We're going to help participants learn how to apply ecological interventions in their practice. We're going to discover some questions that participants can ask to assess the role of religion or spirituality and the role that that might have in a client's plan of care. And then lastly, we're going to talk about the decision tree as laid out by Hodge in 2005 as a guide to help participants choose the most suitable spiritual intervention based on their clients' needs and strengths. And we're going to do that in terms of talking about some of the bigger challenges that we have seen, that we've had, that others of our peers have had as they've tried to do this work connected with eco-spirituality. And one of the biggest challenges with doing any sort of a spiritual assessment or any sort of an approach to evaluate the role that religion or spirituality could have in a client's life is that the practitioner may have little to no experience. We know that as we're going through and we're thinking about schools that have courses in religion, spirituality, clinical, spiritual, social work practice, that while there are more now than there were 10 years ago, 20 years ago, that there's still a dearth in the number of course options available. And in some of the courses that are available, the teaching that is taught is very theory-based and doesn't always have the practical component that is essential. And some of those courses don't deal with the topic of eco-spirituality in a very comprehensive, holistic way. And so that's one of our challenges that we have. And Pius and I are very big on thinking about ways forward so that people can wrap their heads and hearts around what eco-spirituality looks like. And so one of the ways forward with this challenge is to first just get a thought of what eco-spirituality is. So when Pius and I think about eco-spirituality, we think about the integration or the synthesis of spirituality and how a person's spirituality allows them to relate to and connect with their environment. And by doing that, that allows us to gain an appreciation for how we as humans in our everyday environments are interacting with all other environments, forms of environments, be they digital, be they in nature, be they physical and otherwise. And it also gives us an opportunity to think about how our persons and how our beings are flowing through and making sense of the world and navigating the world as fully envisioned, as fully seen individuals. So we think about eco-spirituality in terms of how we can connect that to a model of eco-spirituality at work. And so to do that, we have done a lot of thinking about Kanjursky's and Skrynek's human ecological model of spirit at work. And in that model, there are 4 different avenues or 4 different paths that a person can take, and that in those paths, the path is a reflection of the spirituality, the sense of spirituality that a person has. And it's on a spectrum of some people operating from a place of spirituality being already present, where when they are at work and whatever that form of work looks like, the spirituality and the essence is flowing through all that they think, all that they feel, all that they do. And then on the other side of that spectrum, there are individuals who see that spirituality can be present, but is present in terms of the context. And I know some of the clients that I've worked with particularly have struggled with trying to come to terms with how to embrace spirituality, because some of the environments where they want to be spiritual don't allow them to be whole beings, such as people who might identify as LGBTQIA+. I tend to work with that population very closely. And so as a practitioner, one of the things that we want to think about is how do we create the space for clients to think about and for clients to accept and embrace the forms and the ways that spirituality manifests? And then how do we journey alongside our clients to see that eco-spirituality is not just a part of who they are, but it is who they are, and it's an amalgam of how they operate in the world. And one of the ways that we can do that is to exercise cultural humility. Ortega and Fowler talked about this in 2011. While we have all these fancy letters to back our name up, it's recognizing that our clients are the experts. Our clients know themselves better than we ever will. So while we might have questions that we can ask, it gives us the space to be able to follow our clients' lead. And even if we haven't had traditional coursework in eco-spirituality, if we're learning from and learning with, and we're doing the research and we're asking the key questions and creating space, that can create the conditions for the possibility of gaining expertise and experience to help our clients achieve their goals. In the second challenge, we noticed that While some social workers might have some experience or exposure with eco-spirituality, there's a concern about how we can incorporate eco-spirituality into assessment and treatment plans, especially if the purpose is designed to lessen the probability of a client re-experiencing a presenting need. And so if we're thinking about this beautiful phrase of evidence-based practice and the empirical nature of an evidence-based practice, we're not saying not to use evidence-based practices, because we know that there are spiritual assessments and interventions that are connected to evidence-based practice. But what we're doing is we want to take a step back and think about, if we're working with people in their whole forms, how does that wholeness factor into the plans that we create to help clients achieve their goals? And one of those ways is to remember and recognize that the NASW, even the IFSW, and the EPOS create places where we not only need to have a commitment to diversity, religious diversity, spiritual diversity, but we need to also continue to keep learning, continue to keep educating ourselves, and continue to keep considering how we can see that our tools are not only evidence-based practice, but that they're evidence-based practice that also is mindful of being culturally sensitive, culturally tailored, and that it's meeting our participants' needs. One of the ways that we see that that has happened is through considering the additional ways forward in terms of our spiritual assessment tools, which I'm going to allow Pius to come on and talk with us about those tools.
Thank you, Tayon. There are additional ways of using the spiritual assessment tools and addressing these challenges and concerns that Tayon have rightly mentioned. There are suggestions for selecting appropriate comprehensive tools, which are actually summarized in Hodge decision tree, which you would be seeing in the next slide in detail. But I would like to bring your attention and draw your attention to those tools that are designed to highlight the different facets of clients' spiritual lives. And the clients have various needs and interests in a given therapeutic context, and some approaches may appeal to some situations. That's why we have different tools, different models available, like verbally based approaches or non-verbal cues and verbal approaches. And there are diagrammatic approaches. So there are actually 2 verbally based approaches and 4 diagrammatic approaches, which is also we would see in detail when we go into those 14 assessment questionnaire, which was originally developed by JCAHO, which is called the Joint Commission on Accreditation of Healthcare Organizations, asking those questions about how spirituality serves as a function of personal strength and environmental strength. How do personal beliefs and practices influence their functioning? And also asking questions like whether more comprehensive spiritual assessments required. So questions like, I was wondering if you consider spirituality or religion to be a personal strength, or what ways your spirituality help you cope with the difficulties you encounter, and questions like, are there any certain spiritual beliefs and practices that you find particularly helping in dealing with your particular problems and issues? Those questions would definitely help to make a brief assessment. If the brief assessment is sufficient, actually the comprehensive assessment is warranted. So there are concerns using the spiritual assessment tools, and we would also see the comprehensive spiritual assessment being unpacked in different tools used to developed by Hodge. And we also have this need to compliance with the professional ethics, code of ethics of whatever country that you belong to. or the National Council of Association that you belong to. So therefore, honoring a client autonomy, providing culturally relevant services, and social workers comfortability with discussing religion and spirituality with clients are some of the other ways that we can actually navigate these concerns. Over to Taeyeon. Thank you.
Pius, thank you for that. So given what Pius has shared, Pius has given us a great overview of the Hodges decision tree that we have on the screen there. And what we want to focus on in the time that we have remaining is that once we've made a decision that spirituality and religion plays a role in our clients' lives, we're going to be using at the very bottom there the genogram, the ecogram, the eco map, the life map, or the spiritual history based on the work that the client and the social worker have done together. And an example of that is the family eco map that we have on the screen there. And what this eco map does is it shows how this particular family's understanding of spirituality connects to all the other avenues and facets and arenas in their lives. And as you're working with your client, you want to think about how are these arenas and facets coming together in order to create a sense of how eco-spirituality can help us understand interventions to use as we're working with our clients to help them meet their goals. And with that in mind, I'm going to pass it over to Pius for our final challenge as he talks about using eco-spirituality and spiritual tools, and he'll end with the implications.
Yeah, thank you, Taeyeon. So while analyzing the practical significance of spirituality, especially in healthcare, the question that provokes us as social workers or practitioners, is it possible to understand the fullness of a person looking only at some part of the symptoms or some parts of the issues? Think of the image of a waterfall, the Niagara waterfalls. I kind of refer back to that waterfall because I had personally been to there over 20 times, experiencing and feeling the fullness and the kind of emotion and feelings of that mystery and wonder. So it's just like a moment that you get spiritually, personally. Then you try to interconnect with the universe, with the spirit, which is actually helping you. But that kind of same experience of mystery and wonder is not really experienced when that is being, actually, if you are trying to draw a bucket of water, so you don't kind of experience the same mystery and wonder. So spirituality is always kind of arising primarily from the unique experiences of an individual that are non-replicable and are not seen occurring from a normative knowledge level. So that's why we have this greatest challenge, how best we can use this eco-spirituality and other spiritual assessment tools in our practice. So be open to some of the transformative experiences of the clients, encouraging clients to share their sacred stories, and that could break through the humanistic perspective, and be mindful of the spiritual environment. And we also kind of refer back to Kanda and team, where they have developed this spiritually sensitive practice with those understanding, this designing, analysis, and evaluating and integrating. So bringing all these aspects into the focus, the spiritually sensitive context for practice has been also called as a holistic system of activity, helping us to really see in detail a comprehensive framework that we need to develop. having that experiences of self-awareness and open-mindedness and flexibility, we will be able to actually frame a certain practice which is actually fitting and applicable for the client's experiences.
Wonderful. Pius, thank you so
Thank-
much for that.
thank you.
These are our references, and at the end, we have our email addresses, and we would love to continue the conversation more. Thank you all so much.
Thank you.
Thank you very much, Tyan and Pius. And moving right along, we have another great presentation from Charlize Sangster, who is a registered social worker of Halifax. She's currently a PhD student at Rutgers University, and she has graduated with an MSW from the University of Toronto, BSW from the University of Regina, and BA in Honors Psychology from St. Mary's University. And we also have Dr. Senator Wanda Thomas Bernard from Dalhousie University. Wanda is a professor emeritus at the Dalhousie University School of Social Work. She's a founding member of the Association of Black Social Workers, and her scholarship has focused on issues of Afrocentric practice and the impact of racism on health and well-being. And they will be presenting on spirituality and culturally specific grief and loss, exploring the links.
Hi, thank you so much for that introduction. I'm just here trying to share my screen. It says host disabled participant screen sharing. I'm here on Zoom.
So let's just get that figured out.
Rochelle, are you, can you hear me, Rochelle, online?
Yes, though you should be good to go. Just made you co-host, so everything is perfect.
Awesome, thank you.
And I just want to say a quick word. I do apologize. We have 4 presenters in 4 groups in this session. So this session will go over. We want to make sure everyone has, so we have a 4th speaker after this, and we'll simply go over. The next session is the last of the day in this room. So I think we'll be okay to roll it forward a little bit. Just please make sure to hang around for the fullness and richness of this session. Okay, over to you, Charlize.
Okay, perfect, thank you. All right, share my screen here.
There we go. Okay, we see that.
Okay, can you see the presentation here?
Yes, we can. Yeah, thank you.
Awesome, thank you. So my name is Charlize Sangster. I'm going to present today on a project that I completed with Dr. Wanda Thomas Bernard. Unfortunately, she couldn't be here with us today. But this project was completed on behalf of the Association of Black Social Workers here in Halifax, Nova Scotia. And the title of our presentation is Spirituality and Culturally Specific Grief and Loss, Exploring the Links. So I'd just first like to begin by acknowledging that we are on Mi'kma'ki, the ancestral and unceded territory of the Mi'kmaq people. We are all treaty people. I also want to acknowledge that people of African descent have been here in Nova Scotia for over 400 years, and we honor and offer gratitude to those ancestors who came before us. So thank you so much for the introduction that you gave. Just briefly, I'll go over. So myself, I'm currently a PhD student at the Rutgers University School of Social Work. I've worked in direct care and mental health and addictions for many years, and my research surrounds social justice and advocating against anti-Black racism. And Dr. Wanda Thomas Bernard, she's been a professor at Dalhousie University for many, many years. She's also one of the founding members of ABSW. So I will get into that a little bit later in the presentation, but a lot of her research is focused on Afrocentric practice and issues of racism on health. So this presentation will explore the culturally responsive approaches to dealing with grief and loss from an African-centered perspective. So I'll begin with a discussion of the literature on the role that spirituality plays within the African American and African Canadian communities. I'll then discuss a training initiative that we did. It was led by the Association of Black Social Workers with the goal of helping African Canadian communities deal with the trauma of collective and accumulative loss. And I'll highlight the findings, analysis, and recommendations, and then I'll finish with questions and discussion if we have time. We may not have time. Okay, so for a literature review, Eurocentric principles largely influence the way that service providers work within our systems and support African Canadians. So Eurocentricity remains the main ideology that dominates social work practice here in North America. So we hear a lot about anti-oppressive practice, specifically in social work, it's widely encouraged. However, a lot of Canadian social work education is comprised of Eurocentric curriculums. So Afrocentricity is a term that you'll hear throughout this presentation and hopefully in your practice moving forward. And it can be defined as a frame of reference from the perspective of the African person. It places people of African descent in control of their lives and in the center of their lives. So the literature review revealed the importance of understanding culturally specific practices within the healthcare setting and specifically in social work. So we found there's currently a lack of culturally specific resources available to support African Canadians who are specifically dealing with grief and loss. It's well documented that people of African descent often don't trust or don't use traditional healthcare services. So during the grieving process, people of African descent tend to rely on spiritual rituals and traditions for coping rather than seeking formal support. So this is something that social work practitioners must be aware of in order to provide inclusive care. And then when we speak about being anti-oppressive, it's important to not make assumptions and generalizations about a person's cultural way of experiencing and dealing with grief. So spirituality itself is an essential component of the Afrocentric worldview. So spirituality can refer to the church community, the spiritual community, religion, faith guidance, having a personal relationship with God, and often it's a source of meaning making. Spirituality is known as the essence of our survival or our being, and it keeps us committed to working through the struggle of pain and racial oppression. Spirituality also helps to connect us. So there's lifelong impacts when people are not supported by traditional healing methods. The church for many is a central point of most African American, African Canadian communities, and having a personal connection to the church can help them to cope with racism-related stress. So for example, and I quote, trust that things would work out, that painful times would eventually come to an end, that pain served a higher purpose, that suffering has meaning, and that he has a plan for my life, him as in God, so God is in control, not me. Another thing we found is that many African Americans and African Canadians believe in an afterlife. So life includes birth, death, and continued life as a spirit. The belief in Proverbs is also very powerful. So you hear a lot of phrases such as it's in God's will, and then death is seen as a part of God's plan. So to wrap up the literature review, the three themes we found are the need for culturally specific services to deal with grief and loss, the role that spirituality plays within African Canadian and African American communities, and the interconnection between grief, loss, and spirituality, specifically in the context of African American and African Canadians. So the objectives of our study, we created the Culturally Responsive Grief Training Initiative. So this training was developed and led by members of the Association of Black Social Workers here in Nova Scotia. And our objectives as part of this research was to explore the outcomes of this program and if the outcomes of offering this resource to community members. So the research questions that we came in with were, what are the culturally specific coping strategies when dealing with grief and loss among African Canadians? And what role does spirituality play in this process? Just to give a quick background on the Association of Black Social Workers, it's ABSW here. So we're a volunteer charitable organization consisting of Black social workers and human service workers in Nova Scotia. We emerged here in Nova Scotia in 1979 with only 4 members, and Dr. Bernard was one of those founding 4. The key mission of ABSW is to act as a support group and a professional development resource for African Canadian social workers to offer services and develop programs in the interest of the Black community. So ABSW, for this project in particular, ABSW provided training to community members and service providers on culturally appropriate ways to manage individual and collective grief. So training took place here in Dartmouth. Registration filled very quickly, which highlighted the need that our community had. 2 additional training sessions were offered. So in total, 60 people completed the training, all of whom worked within one of the helping professions. Of those 60 people, 20 participants were then selected to host workshops in various African Nova Scotian communities. So these workshops were 2 to 3 hours long. They offered a safe place for attendees to learn about the grieving process, learn about healing strategies, local cultural resources, openly share experiences in culturally specific contexts. So the priority areas of topics that were discussed were health inequities, sense of belonging, mental health, and stress, which simultaneously helped to promote community growth and development. The goal was to enhance the capacity of the African Canadian healthcare professionals in providing culturally relevant support services, specifically to a demographic most in need and often neglected by mainstream agencies. So we had 5 project goals. The first was to empower African Canadian service providers by helping them to develop skills needed to support their communities, to empower community members through their healing journeys, to encourage the use of culturally relevant coping strategies, to provide a safe space for open dialogue and cultural and generational reflection, and also to share and encourage community members to seek local cultural resources. So throughout this project, we found 3 key themes. The first was spirituality. So spirituality was identified as a source of strength, support, and survival. Spiritual connection helped participants to deal with individual and collective grief. This was particularly evident when we were discussing ways to support African Nova Scotian families who have been either directly or indirectly impacted by gun violence and its root causes. The second theme was collective grief. So participants were most intrigued by the discussion of the roots of collective grief, including generational trauma, the impact of structural violence, racism, and the legacy of slavery. So participants discussed other issues that compounded grief and loss, such as addictions, employment, poverty, family fragmentation, and institutional barriers. So participants reported having a better understanding of the grieving process, pausing coping strategies, and the ways in which collective grief was manifested specifically in their communities. We found that the legacy of slavery lives in the shadow of racism for many. It's produced intergenerational trauma, anger, resentment, low self-esteem, feelings of alienation. And the grief and loss associated with slavery has not necessarily been addressed in the African Nova Scotian community. So we found that many struggled to share their experiences, specifically when existing within a dominant Eurocentric society or a Eurocentric healthcare system. The third theme that we found was silence. So talking about feelings or acknowledging feelings doesn't often happen. There's a silence about the trauma of racism, the impacts of racism, and the legacy of slavery, largely because the reality of slavery has never formally been acknowledged. So this has left the community vulnerable in many ways, and it's important to consider, especially when thinking about issues such as the root causes of violence, specifically gun violence in our communities, and larger collective grief and community loss. So many participants understood the grieving process and how grief had impacted their lives. Some had highlighted feelings of anxiety and impacts of multi-generational trauma. However, the reality of cultural norms that have developed over time have led them to concealing these emotions. So many participants shared that they hide their pain from family and loved ones, and they discussed the historical trend of not telling on each other, specifically in terms of violence or gun violence within the community. So for our analysis, each of the themes that I discussed prior were consistent with what we found in the literature review. So the outcomes of this project illustrate the value of engaging in grief training from an Afrocentric perspective. It was highlighted that culturally specific grieving processes have been impaired by Eurocentric ideologies and structural barriers. So for example, the mental health impacts of racism and oppression, the legacy of slavery, the subsequent culture of silence. So there's a need for culturally responsive services and interventions from an Afrocentric worldview in particular. This project itself was successful in providing culturally responsive training to service providers and community members. So participants reported gaining knowledge of Afrocentric approaches to individual and collective healing, as well as local cultural resources. This reiterated the importance for practitioners to be aware of local Afrocentric services with greater awareness of available supports. It's predicted that there will be an increase in the number of families that seek support for managing grief and loss during their time of need. So the impact of the training was significant, with participants indicating the many ways in which the new learning would influence their future practices in the field. And then something else I just want to note is that the focus on the African Canadian and the African American experience is an acknowledgement that we all can benefit from awareness of diverse rituals and beliefs. And it doesn't necessarily suggest that people from other cultures could not benefit from exploring and internalizing these values. So cultural sensitivity, it doesn't mean that somebody knows everything about all cultures, but it just reminds us to always be conscious that there's different cultures and to approach these cultures with respect and willingness to learn. So future directions, the literature review revealed how little is written on grief and loss from an Afrocentric perspective, specifically from Canadian scholars. It's important that more Canadian research is undertaken, especially here in Nova Scotia. As I mentioned, people of African descent have a vibrant history in this province, and they've been here since the 1600s. So suggestions for future research would include an in-depth exploration of grief and loss from an Afrocentric worldview as it relates to African Canadian communities specifically. Suggestions for future practice includes the development of more culturally specific services and interventions to support traditional healing methods. The Association of Black Social Workers, ABSW, was encouraged to network with other organizations and stakeholders to continue engaging in social justice work. And then beyond individual healing, participants actually called for the recognition of gun violence as a public health issue, and that systemic racism be seen as a pandemic requiring systemic interventions. So I did end off with some discussion questions. I don't think we'll have time to really go through it. But yeah, that's the end of our presentation, and here's our references if anybody's interested.
Thank you, Shalise. We do have time for We do have time for at least one question. So would anyone like to ask a question, or even the two discussion questions that Shalise has posed? Any thoughts that are coming up for folks? And Shalise, do you have a contact email? Maybe if you can put that up or just say it out loud so that folks can contact you if they would like to.
Yeah, sure. Yeah.
I have a quick question for Shalise. Shalise, you had mentioned that you had found out about and were teaching some of the African-centric interventions to people who were experiencing grief and loss. And I wondered if it would be helpful or even appropriate to share any of those interventions that you found were quite helpful in this with this group.
Yes, that might be something that's best to talk about via email, because it was a whole training program.
Oh, okay. Okay. So I wondered if it would be too long of a response to give here.
Yeah, no, but I would love to chat with you about it. I didn't actually put my email in the slides. I don't know if there's a way to.
I'm sure I can find it from the conference organizers.
Okay, thanks.
Thank you.
I would love to chat more for sure.
Thanks.
Hey, thank you very much, Shalise.
Thank you.
Such important work. Shalise, we just heard from, and during the study that she spoke about and doing with Senator Juan and Thomas Bernard, I was so pleased to see that they had committed to mission. Senator Bernard was the director of the School of Social Work here at Dell for 10 years and a professor for many years before that. A really prominent, strong figure here in Nova Scotia within the university. So and very powerful work important work coming from the Association of Black Social Workers in Nova Scotia. I'm glad to see bias on this. I don't know if people can hear me, but we had so many correspondences going back and forth. Yeah, it's nice to put a face to. I could type in, well, actually, while we're waiting, I'll put
I am. That's a good help us here. Just need to get. Okay, and as Dr. Odeta is getting set up, I'll just introduce her. So Terry S. O'Date is the owner, founder, and practitioner at Ortesh Therapy Services in Queens, New York since 2015. She's a doctoral graduate and a lecturer at New York University Silver School of Social Work. Additionally, she obtained her master's in social work at Silberman School of Social Work at Hunter College, CUNY. She facilitates couple seminars, workshops, is also a licensed massage therapist, and I'm very happy to welcome Dr. O'Date.
Good afternoon, all, and thank you for that introduction, and thank you for joining me here today. I will do my earnest best to compound this level of work. And how much time do I have? 20 minutes or so. All right, that will be a new challenge for me. So the work that I've done primarily in spirituality and social work has been more of an introspective work where I looked at how to use spirituality as an intervention, and that intervention is via the use of psychosynthesis. Now, when I stumbled across psychosynthesis, I realized that I've never heard about it before, and this was something that was certainly intriguing to me. Before I get into the learning objectives of the presentation today, I do want to just talk a little bit about my self-concept. I promise there'll be some purpose to that. But my concept before entering into social work program, as well as becoming a doctor of clinical social work, in the very early years of my life was that of deprecating thoughts, negativity, negative thoughts, negative perception and understanding of who I was, the lack of understanding my core and my connection with my spirit. There were times when I had very sabotaging, self-deprecating, self-sabotaging experiences. As a result, my life was in shambles. I had negative self-talk in my mind where I thought that I was no good. I didn't feel I was worthy of having the best in life. I didn't feel like I was worthy of anything that was good. And as a result, because of the low self-concept that I had, my decisions was conclusive of such. My decisions that rendered experiences that were just not beneficial to me in my life at all. And so I started out by talking about that because the self-concept is very important when you're engaging in spirituality. The self-concept primarily is what will allow one to feel and have meaning in life. So I will stop there, and I'll just talk a little bit about the learning objectives in my session today. And that is, what is psychosynthesis, the theoretical background of psychosynthesis, skills used in psychosynthesis. I will only primarily talk about one. And I also talk about the benefits of psychosynthesis and the implication for practice. And I'm not sure if I'll get to talk about the case study, but hopefully be able to include some of the work that I've done thus far. So what is psychosynthesis? Excuse me for my papers. This is such an intricate work that I've worked on that I just wanted to make sure that I capture all the points. So I will be reading some from my work. The incorporation of spiritual intervention in a therapeutic social work setting is a question that remains unresolved in the field. We've heard our previous presenters talk about this and share about that. Therapy that includes a spiritual component has been reported to improve medical outcome treatments based on their experiences of beneficial results. Many clients have requested their spiritual beliefs be acknowledged in a therapeutic setting and environment. We've heard this from Hodge, who wrote about this in a paper in 2013. Conversely, practitioners are ill-prepared, we've heard that here today, to address such matters in the field. Anxiety over being perceived as proselytizing or the lack of appropriate training and limited academic support and research, among other factors, prevent many social workers from implementing spiritual intervention or practice in clinical social work settings. Case in point, when I went through the doctorate program at NYU, New York University, although there was Anthony who taught the spirituality in social work class, because we needed a doctorate level chairperson and persons, No one in the school, no one in our program could really guide me on this intervention, in this work that I was doing, which was telling. And so I had to seek the advice of my mentor who had helped me, but I primarily went through this program all by myself. Clients cannot heal when practitioners, if you will, clients cannot heal if practitioners themselves are not equipped to heal themselves. I'll say that again. Clients cannot heal when practitioners are not equipped to help service users to heal on a spiritual level. Indeed, for spiritual healing to take place, it must be addressed at all levels, not only just the physical, the mental, or the emotional, but on the spiritual. Roberto Assagioli, a psychiatrist and a psychoanalyst, which I'll speak to a little bit later, said this, that ultimate healing, a wholesome healing, has to occur on all 4 levels. If one of them is missing, then you don't have true wholesome healing. So as I studied and as I went through this doctorate program, I did come across Roberto Assagioli, who's a psychiatrist and a psychoanalyst, who developed this idea of psychosynthesis and identified an urgent need for a science of self, of its energies, its manifestations, of how these energies can be released, how they can be contacted, and how they can be utilized for the constructive therapeutic work. Assagioli's work was based on the observation that energy supports all of life on the universe. Therefore, psychosynthesis was formulated with the aim of integrating all aspects of the human being, the mental, the physical, the emotional, and the spiritual. As a form of psychotherapy, psychosynthesis is a dynamic method of facilitating the introspective recognition of previous self-constructs and reconstruction of the personality around the essence of the human being, a process that can forge a spiritual connection with the highest self. We as humans grapple every day with energy in many forms and present challenges from outside and from within. External challenges present opportunities for growth and spiritual advancement depending on the individual's response. Some of this was paraphrased by Brown, Viktor Frankl, Maslow, and Assagioli. Psychosynthesis uses an intervention of visualization, among other techniques, to heighten conscious awareness and eventually transform the trauma energy of good. This study examined the theoretical basis of psychosynthesis, which integrates a holistic practice and a therapeutic approach with its roots in transpersonal and humanistic psychology to address the spiritual dimensions of clients' lives in the social work therapy. Arriving at this point is akin to a spiritual journey, a process that will be illustrated possibly in a case study that I'll be able to share later on, which is the process of removing one's sense of self, a previous construct or thinking of one's sense of self, and transforming that via a skill called self-disidentification, which is the process of removing one's previous form of self from a role, attitude, or some personality and a limited aspect of oneself to allow the development of more of a wholesome self, inclusive of the self that is capitalized with the capital S, the higher self aspect, referring to a connection with the higher self. So a theoretical framework. The focus of this work is in the healing of individuals' neuroses and psychopathologies. Where am I going? Okay. Development research, object relations therapy, intersubjective psychology, and trauma and recovery movements were all, as well as Hungarian humanistic transpersonal approaches to psychology, all have taken different approaches to the same basic problems. The subjectivity of spiritual realm makes it difficult to describe or evaluate using empirical evidence. However, finding a therapeutic modality that can heal the whole person, which is especially urgent following traumatic events or when seeking to help when treat individuals or people with severe psychopathologies. Assagioli developed the psychosynthesis as a method that relies on scientific data about the experiences of human beings to address the abstraction the abstraction of the spiritual. Understand, the meaning of psychology means psych of the soul, a study of the soul. But where mainstream psychology mainly largely denies the existence of a soul as a spiritual core. Psychosynthesis places the soul at the center of the human experience. And so I want to talk a little bit about the theoretical pioneers who kind of forged the way to make this happen. First and foremost, like I mentioned before, Roberto Assagioli was born in 1888, died in 1974. And he's an Italian psychiatrist and a psychoanalyst who was decades ahead of humanistic and transpersonal psychology, despite the fact that he came later after Freud and after Jung in terms of when he made his presence known. He's accredited for contributing to 3 revolutions of psychology, again, psychoanalysis, humanistic psychology, as well as transpersonal psychology. We have Sigmund Freud, recognized as a father of psychoanalysis, as a method of gaining access to and understanding the subpersonalities. His background, yes, although Assagioli was fascinated with Freud's psychoanalytic work, he decided that it didn't meet his needs, meaning he wanted to he felt that Sigmund Freud was too concerned about the biological determinisms. And so Assagioli's focus on the human psyche, he wanted to focus more on the spiritual aspects. He pioneered a more inclusive psychology encompassing aspects of Freud's personality work. Assagioli also worked with Carl Jung, the founder of analytical psychology, who focused on individuation and the core theme of his work, and described his ideas in the book, including Man of Search of a Soul, as well as the undiscovered self. Jung's consciousness and his perception, feeling like consciousness was the mother of all consciousness, and that consciousness was and is the spirit of man. His work and himself and others led him to develop ideas that Abraham Maslow would later talk to and speak to, the self-actualization, where Assagioli felt that it was considered, or better termed, as self-realization. So the common thread with all these pioneers was that they all experienced some form of existential crises that had led them to get to this point and want to create an understanding that would be universal to all. So the practice of psychosynthesis psychology is a journey into the discovery of a higher self via an investigation aimed at understanding the psyche and developing a relationship with the self that supersedes the previous establishment of false identifications. Psychosynthesis differs from psychoanalysis in the emphasis on the synthesis and not the analysis of a personal and spiritual that transcends religiosity and multicultural secular branches. Lombard and Muller stated the psychosynthesis is an integral transpersonal psychology that provides a universal framework to an understanding of one's body, feelings, attitude, and behavior into a harmonious and synthesized whole that includes all of the human dimensions: physical, emotional, mental, and spiritual. It begins in the individual's inner world first, unconsciously, and then consciously when the individual embarks on a journey into the discovery of the most subtle parts of himself. Its goal is to harmonize and reconcile the conflicts and divisions of individual experiences in themselves, with others, with the society at large. I want to just now go into the aspects of the self that Assagioli speaks about, which helps to make this differentiation of what it means to ascend or have transpersonal experiences. Within, and I'll show you a couple of diagrams in a minute, but within the aspect of the self, you have the lower, you have the middle, and you have this higher self concept. In the lower self concept, or the lower self, it's equipped or equivalent to Freud's primitive compulsive urges, phobias, fears, delusions, and obsessions. Then you have in the middle subconscious, you have the lower self or a sense of the waking consciousness, if you will, which is an aggregate of your conclusions, an aggregate of the conclusions that you have about yourself in this present moment. Then you have an aspect of the higher self, which is which informs high inspiration and intuition. It has artistic capabilities, philosophical and scientific, altruistic love, and you're connected to the higher self, to the ether, to a higher consciousness. This is Assagioli's egg diagram, which is a simplistic view of how he wanted to illustrate the different aspects of the personality, of the self, right? So you have the lower self at the bottom, and number 2 in the middle, you have the middle consciousness. You also have a field of consciousness that's outside of that realm. And then number 3 and number 5 and 6 are more of spiritual selves or spiritual avenues and venues where you can receive intuition from the ether, from consciousness, from angels, right? And so the higher consciousness is what Assagioli calls the region we receive higher intuitions. Okay, this realm is latent. In this realm is latent the higher psychic functions and spiritual energies. Okay, I don't know what that is.
It's like somebody's phone is going off.
I don't know. I don't know. Sorry, we were notified about something. Okay, and I'll just continue. Above the superconscious, beyond the self, is it connected to the ether, to the universe. Let me just move on. Okay, so during this process of reaching psychosynthesis, because there is 2 paths, there is a skill that is often used called self-disidentification. And self-disidentification allows and helps the individual to journey into a place where they rid the previous or the current self-constructs within them to uphold and to walk into a different self-concept. And this process is done through self-actualization. The journey to reach in personal, or rather the journey to reach in personal and spiritual psychosynthesis is in the discovery of the selves of one true essence of that space. Self-disidentification allows for individuals to notice and recognize their maladaptive thoughts, understanding that they are not their thoughts. If we are spiritual beings having this human experience, then therefore, how are we in the essence of being having this aspect within us that is part of the Great Spirit, how is that entity going to also allow for negative thoughts, negative self-constructs, negative perceptions and understandings of self? The 2 cannot coexist. Okay, so if there was someone who had or experienced pervasive trauma, which is not the prerequisite of psychosynthesis, but although the practice is particularly useful applications in such cases, when a person has a rush of stimuli composed of a series of negative emotions and confusion regarding the self, responsibility and identity, which are downloaded into this lower subconsciousness, there's this period of this existential questioning that often follows. And so an individual's thoughts about themselves may suddenly be dramatically altered when this trauma is accepted, if you will, or the thoughts, rather. We don't accept trauma, but the thoughts as a result of the trauma is accepted. Disidentification allows the client to let go of the previous trauma memory that allowed for the negative concerns and the sense of self defined by the trauma, leaving room for new and more beneficial conceptualizations of the self that is fundamentally connected to the ground level of all being. Identification with limited aspects of the self robs individuals of the opportunity to heal and adopt positive traits. The core of the identification of this higher self achieved through psychosynthesis is the insight that people are not the result of their experiences. Psychosynthesis allows for the practitioner to look past the conscious mind, to enable clients to access the repressed and unconscious memories through the emotions associated with them. This process allows and brings the unconscious experience of trauma to the level of consciousness for analysts for analysts, dissection, reinterpretation, lessons, and unhealthy or ultimately, not unhealthy, but ultimately identification to the higher self. So this is a diagram that I drew to help explain the process where you have at the lower consciousness, these primitive ideas, these fears, these phobias, and in the center, you'll notice along the red line, there is lessons. And what happens throughout this process is when you're looking at your the concept of self or the aggregate of your experiences and your conclusions, when you're looking at that, and you keep in mind that you are a spiritual being having this human experience, and that has become or is your self, your new self-concept, you allow that energy, you allow that understanding to walk you through the previous maladaptive thoughts or maladaptive self-concepts, and allow that process with the understanding that you are a spiritual being having this human experience. You allow that transcendent experience to allow your highest self to reconclude your understanding of self. Then therefore your trauma is no longer looked at as something that that is painful, but not to disempower that, but to look at and perceive and allow your conclusions to benefit now this sense of higher self, this sense of self aspect of a higher self. And when you can conclude in a beneficial way to support your new improved higher self or concept of self, then your conclusions and your life, your outcomes, the way you live becomes different. You then become or find more meaning to life. You're becoming more actualized. As Asujoli says, more self-realized, understanding that you're more than what you think. You're more than who you think you are. All right. There is two processes, two psychosynthesis. There's a personal process or journey, and there's a spiritual journey. I'm often asked, well, what if someone is not religious or doesn't practice spirituality? That's okay. There's a personal psychosynthesis that occurs where you feel that you've reached a place in your life where you are self-actualized, where you feel like you're no longer subject to these thoughts that have kept you away or kept you down for so long. And then the other path is spiritual psychosynthesis. And so this is the journey to discovering your higher self in psychosynthesis. And I offer and I share this with individuals that perhaps this could be a process that we can use in our field as an intervention, because we talk about assessments, we talk about, and all of that is very purposeful, all of that is needed. But how do we now use this psychosynthesis as an actual intervention to not only bring about meaning in people's lives, but to bring transformation in people's lives? So what's the need? Funding for research in this area, meeting the needs of the spiritual needs of our clients. Spiritually trained clinicians is important. We know that there's a dearth of training available, and a universal approach in academia. Stats, we know the stats. We know that there's a need for more spirituality training and lessons, but perhaps now we want to look at an intervention that will be inclusive of all religions, that will be inclusive of all people's backgrounds, no matter where you come from. So I only have less than 1 minute. I can't go through the case study, but there is this process that I went through in terms of talking about how to actually start this process and prepare a client for the session I call it pre-session synthesis. And these are different ways that I help the client to calm themselves down so that we can go through this experience. And the case study that I was going to speak about was Felicia, who actually went through this experience. And she, just to make it real short, she experienced a transformation that she actually, I believe she said she was starting to write about it. I met with this client about 6 years ago. Psychosynthesis is not something that can happen in 6 to 12 sessions. However, it is, I met with her for over 5 years. Today, she talks about how grateful and how transformative psychotherapy has been for her. She speaks about it to this day, still calls me ever so often, and is very appreciative. The implications is that Spiritual psychotherapy can be another practice modality for clinicians, offering the opportunity to completely heal from our psychoses and trauma. Necessary qualitative studies, funding to support research, and expanded curriculum in spirituality. Future work, continue to write in this area, possibly conduct research in this area, develop a curriculum that can teach this material as an approach to social work. There are no limits with psychosynthesis. And so in conclusion, psychosynthesis psychotherapy can be used as a tool in clinical social work to enable healing at the physical, mental, emotional, and spiritual levels. Psychosynthesis generates an inner power that directs our evolution through certain universal stage development from body, psyche, and the soul to spiritual consciousness. Assagioli viewed psychosynthesis psychotherapy as a scientific method that welcomes investigation. Therefore, further research on the benefits of psychosynthesis psychology would be a meaningful contribution to our field. Pages and pages of references. Thank you all for your time and thank you all for listening. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you very much,
You're
Dr.
welcome.
Day.
Thank you.
And if people need to get in touch with you,
They can reach me at TA329@nyu.edu. Thank you so much.
Thank you.
All right. Uh-oh.
I'll have to call on you. Okay, looks like we're back in business. So the next session is titled Intentional Community Living as an Education Model for Eco-Spiritual Training in Social Work. And the presenters are Maureen Smith and Dean Nicholson. And I'll just read you a little bit about them. So Maureen Smith is an MSW or CSW, works as a clinical social worker and lives at Clear Sky Retreat Center. For over 16 years, she has benefited from and witnessed the power and healing potential of engaging in the practices and operation of this center. And then we have Dean Nicholson, who is an MA or CC, is a therapist, supervisor, administrator, researcher, with over 33 years of clinical experience in the mental health and substance use field. Dean is a board member and long-term resident of the Clear Sky Retreat Center, and he has conducted environmental research and been an environmental educator. So welcome, Maureen and Dean.
Sure, why not? It's like karaoke. Are we good?
Could we ask that you guys share your screen prior for the online participants?
Crunch, crunch. Well, okay, great. Thank you so much.
Thank you.
Hello, everyone. We're delightful to be here with everyone, and thank you for having us. All the way across the landmass from BC. We want to thank the organizers for putting this conference together. We know that it's a huge amount of work to put on things like this. So yay, way to go. Kudos. We believe that the topic toward eco-spirituality, holistic and sustainable social work practice is hugely important today. And not just for social workers, but for all people living and working in the human service field who are trying to reduce suffering and improve well-being.
Thank you. Yeah, and in our presentation today, we're going to talk briefly about life in an intentional spiritual community, which has as part of its organizing structure a focus on spiritual and environmental generativity. And more specifically, we're going to share with you and introduce an intensive 3-month program that our community offers to people. and then look at ways that aspects of that program could be turned into a practicum experience in a social work context.
Right. So we want to acknowledge the land that we're currently on, Mi'kmaqi, and the ancestral and unceded territory of the Mi'kmaq. And the place where we live, the land in BC, is located on the traditional and unceded Ktunaxa territory. And as descendants of European settlers, we're so grateful for all the support that all Indigenous people in their ongoing engaged stewardship of the land of the whole globe. Yeah.
So just a little bit more about ourselves. We have a number of different hats. So just want to give you a sense of who we are. As Sonia said, Maureen and I both live at the Clear Sky Meditation and Study Center. We're part of a small but dedicated team that help to co-manage the center and put on all of the various programming that it does. We also work at a nonprofit agency in the city next to the center, which does substance use and addiction services. We're working in that field. And we're also business partners in Alive Mindfully. And that's how we're showing up here today at the conference. Through Alive Mindfully, we're therapists in private practice and provide counseling, consultation, and meditation retreats.
So if you get confused, that's okay.
This is where we live.
We get confused a lot. The intentional spiritual community we live at, Clear Sky Retreat Center, is an ongoing experiment in modern communal spiritual living. At different times, we call it a center, a monvent, monastery, convent, and a living laboratory. Clear Sky has lofty goals, conducting leading edge learning experiences. We choose to live there because it's a holistic and inclusive center where there's a group of people live and work and play together in an ongoing way to decrease suffering in ourselves and the world.
Sonia just told me we have 20 minutes, not 30.
Okay, super.
We're going to talk faster or cut some stuff.
Should we not look at the video?
Maybe we'll skip that video.
Okay.
Yeah, okay.
Yeah.
So one of the things that's important to us is that Clear Sky is what we call a lineage center. So the wisdom traditions that we follow come from three different paths: from Karma Kagyu Vajrayana Buddhism, from Theravadan Buddhism, and from Western mysteries traditions. And on the Buddhist side, our teachers and their teacher, we can trace direct lineage right back through two different lines to Siddhartha Gautama, the original personage of the Buddha. And Clear Sky was founded by Kapel Doug Duncan, seen here, and his partner Sensei Catherine Poisrat in 2005. Their virtual teaching organization is known as Planet Dharma.
And you can see we have a lot of fun here with them. So their teacher, Namgyal Rinpoche, he's born and raised in Toronto by parents of Irish and Scottish descent. He was recognized by the 16th Karmapa Kalu Rinpoche, Sakya Trinzen Rinpoche, and others as an embodiment of Namgyal Rinpoche, and received transmissions of the Karma Kagyu lineage. So just to give you a sense of kind of the foundation that we're standing on.
So as we said, Clear Sky is a laboratory in which we're practicing the Namgyal lineage teachings. It's a supportive space to do meditation, study, service, and to liberate the personal shadow with the aim of awakening in this lifetime. As a nonprofit organization, which is what the Clear Sky Center is, we have the following vision, mission, and quadruple bottom line. So our vision is we're creating a revolutionary center for awakening. Our mission is empowering you to transform struggle and embrace vitality. And our quadruple bottom line is to be spiritually, environmentally, socially, and financially generative.
And the title of this conference looks at ways of developing sustainable social work practice. This is crucial. Yeah.
I just got word that you need to share your screen with the folks in the virtual world.
Okay.
Oh.
So let me just step behind you. And
Sure.
Thank you for jumping in.
Apologies to the people in the virtual world.
Yeah, so just taking a minute here to, can you see our presentation on the screen somewhere?
I don't think we're on that screen.
Oh, God.
He operated that device behind me.
Yeah. Okay, and you're using your own computers.
Okay. Rochelle? Rochelle? So I guess what's happening is that they have their presentations on their own laptops. Can you, oh, I know. Can you go into your email and open up the virtual link? Do you have a link for the virtual platform?
I think
You could.
so.
If you go to into your email, it'll just take a minute, folks. For your email and there should be a link and then you could share your document.
Right.
Oh, I'm not even on internet. It might be a while. I've been struggling to get on.
The problem is we weren't able to get onto the internet. We weren't able to connect with the Wi-Fi.
Mm.
No.
Mm-hmm. So let's see if we can do that.
It's not like if you have your book and you plugged it in and then you could open it up here.
Oh, is this the link here?
Yeah. Yeah, go there. So you scroll down and this is the link for today. So, but can you email this to yourself and then open your email here? Like, so email, so can you open your email on this? Hold on, everybody. We'll take a 5-minute pause. So please, everybody stay and we'll return. There's this thing on. Maybe I'll let you do it if you want to just, I want to stop the video just so she can get into her email.
Yay.
Carry on. Thank you for our in-house tech specialist and
Yeah.
conference delegate, multi-talent.
Thank you so much.
Well,
Sorry about that.
Yeah, thanks for your patience, everybody. One of the great things about having an ongoing spiritual practice is the development of equanimity. To be able to stay calm and grounded in the midst of all the hurly and burly. So here's a good example.
Thank you so much. Yeah, you can't overemphasize that.
No.
Where were we?
Well, I think you were going to talk about the title of the conference. Yeah.
Okay, something's crucial, the title of this conference. The world's in rough shape. As we know, the work we all do to reduce suffering at the individual, communal, and global levels difficult and taxing. We need to be able to find ways to sustain ourselves while we're doing it. At Clear Sky, we aim to be not only sustainable, but generative, to develop and practice ways to grow and flourish despite the challenges.
And that all starts with the view that we're operating from. Now, an intentional spiritual community such as Clear Sky has as its highest priority the spiritual growth and well-being of the consciousness of all of its members. So we function from a spiritual perspective that directs everything that we do. The people who live at Clear Sky, currently there's 11 long-term residents, are focused on spiritual awakening in this lifetime to reduce the suffering of others. And a key aspect of the spiritual perspective is learning to get beyond our own narrow, ego-driven perspective and to learn how to function with a broader view. And this includes developing a global or group perspective, a long-term ecological perspective, and a long-term human development perspective over generations.
Clear Sky is an experiment in intentional group living. It involves spiritual practice, training in leadership and communication and community living, as well as direct involvement with the environment through our location on 310 acres of wilderness property. And through our eco restoration initiatives, we have a food forest and gardens and daily direct contact with the wildlife on our property.
In addition to running all aspects of the center, those of us who live there also have day jobs to sustain us. As residents of Clear Sky, we have clinical counselors, social workers, money coaches, sex therapists, translators, traditional Chinese medicine practitioners, and business managers. And we have all faced the challenges of mental health, addictions, and life purpose questions at some point in our lives. Usually that's the reason we've ended up at Clear Sky and developed this sustainable practice for ourselves.
In order to be able to deal with the challenges of life today, social work students, like all of us, would benefit from increased awareness and growth. And we've identified 3 key areas of development that we think would be important for that.
Number one, how do we live with ourselves? We believe that people need to be able to see and work through their core developmental issues and wounds, similar to what the speaker just earlier was speaking to. To us, this means that recognizing childhood ego wounds and the core conditioning that we got while growing up, and the wounds around basic survival needs, such as access to resources, through money, connection, through sex and relationship, and through individuation, through how we learn to develop our own power. We need to see how the unresolved issues show up as shadow issues that affect us in terms of how we interact internally and with the world around us.
And then secondly, what's the point of it all? I think people really need a vision bigger than themselves, a purpose that's larger than just ourselves.
And 3, how do we live with others? We believe that people need to have an experience of community living that goes beyond the experience of nuclear family living, and that we need to have the experience of living in a way where the ego-focused preoccupation that the consumer capitalist culture that we live in encourages is challenged and is able to be transcended.
Oh, yeah.
So one of the ways that one of the things we do there, one of our key programs is called the 3-month intensive karma yoga program.
Yep.
It's a program that goes beyond theory to embrace total experiential learning. So people are able to come and live with us for 3 months. And want to just go to the next slide, Maureen?
Aren't we waiting until we go there?
Nope, we'll go there now.
Okay.
As you can see in this slide, this is a very structured 12-week program with 4 learning components: karma yoga, or our meditation through service and action, integrating practices, learning meditation, and wisdom study. These components are presented in learning modules each day, and are then integrated into all aspects of the lived community experience. The 3-month intensive program is really like a 1-year university learning experience condensed into three months. The program consists of a diverse curriculum of spiritual, communication, psychological, and leadership training embedded in a fully immersive communal living experience.
The important thing that we've discovered is that it is the lived experience that creates the greatest opportunity for growth. Of course, you all know theoretical and book learning alone is not enough for the lasting depth change that we need to embody if we want to grow spiritually and to be able to cope with changes in the climate and society, so that we are not like Master Sen's donkey loaded down with books. Practicums are intended to offer the lived experience to complement book learning. Social work practicums train the professional aspects of the person as social workers, and at Clear Sky we focus on training the whole person to be a whole and healthy adult.
I'm just going to give you a very quick overview of some of the theories, disciplines, and practices that we actively use on a daily basis and that people in this program get to be trained in. So with the first area, how do we become aware of ourselves and the core wounds? We look at things like Maslow's hierarchy of needs, Adam Cohen's stretch collaboration, introduction to money, sex, and power, survival, identity, and control issues, Buddhist meditative tools such as understanding the 5 hindrances and the 7 factors of awakening, Ken Wilber's work on integral spirituality, Harville Hendricks and Helen LaKelly's Hunt's Imago relationship therapy, Lencioni's The 5 Dysfunctions of a Team, and Peter Senge's 5th Discipline.
And in the second topic that we thought was important, how to develop clear overarching vision and purpose at all levels, individually, socially, and globally. We use Buddhist concentration training, explore the spiritual container. What is it? How to create one for yourself. Karma yoga, a lot of karma yoga, the path of service. Generosity practice, which is dana in Sanskrit. Daily meditation group, foundations of health, what is self-care, how to be generative to ourselves. And we explore like the foundation, food, kitchen, our relationship to the archetypal mother and being nurtured.
And then finally, how do we focus on life in community with awareness and compassion? Well, we prepare and eat all meals together. And then, boy, if you want to learn about some of your early conditioning, it's interesting to see how people react when they're all eating around the table together. We get to see what kind of foods we like and don't like, depending on who's cooking and deciding what we're going to eat that day. We all work together on the land, including in our food forest and gardens, in our eco-restoration projects, in overall maintenance of 300 acres and all the buildings, as well as things like learning how to turn compost and how to get rid of invasive weeds, how to move horse manure from the 2 horses we have on the property. We look at what in Buddhist philosophy is called the 3 poisons: greed, hatred, and delusion. So we get to see our personal preference mind at work, and I want this, I don't want that, and I don't know what I want. So we get to see how this plays out in terms of our own view and positioning. We do things like the CAPS personality tests, look at the Arbinger Institutes, the Anatomy of Peace. We do workshopping on developing vision, values, and purpose. Immunity to Change, Leahy and Keegan's work. We look at communication and compassion from a Vajrayana Buddhist perspective, Otto Scharmer's work on listening, Gary Chapman's 4 Languages of Love, et cetera, et cetera. One of the things we do as a group, community experiences, we have weekly fun night. It's not all hard work. And people have to take turns picking what the fun activity is going to be for that night. And again, it's interesting to see that not everybody likes karaoke or likes charades or what movies people pick. And yet, as a group, we all have to learn how to engage in that and notice how our own personal preferences kick up or don't kick up.
Right, yeah. So you can see it's a pretty full curriculum that's both taught and actively embodied 24/7. We suggest that elements of our intensive program could be incorporated into social work education to create a practicum opportunity for new students to learn how to meet the challenges of today and tomorrow. We think of it as a kind of practicum plus, you have to use the most, program. Social work practicum placements are training for how to be a professional social worker in a chosen field of experience. And we've seen it's also essential to train people to become professional. Got it. Thank you. Professional human adults in order to meet the stressors and demands of life in every walk of life, including social work careers. So this is necessary given the climate that we're living in today.
And then so briefly, and we'll just being popped to the next slide. What we suggest is that it proposed that these elements or aspects of these elements could be developed into a 1 to 2 semester practicum learning experience in a social work curriculum that would include both distance education learning, as well as the development of a sustained spiritual practice with the guidance of experienced teachers, therapy to address the core developmental or early conditioning wounds, and then a 2 to 4 week lived experience at the center to put all this into practice in the lived community experience.
Yeah, and we just wanted to wrap up with a little personal stories. I'm been living at Clear Skies since it was started in 2005, and I moved there to be the first caretaker. And service is something that comes fairly naturally and easily to me. And even after 20 years of being trained by my teachers and my community of spiritual practitioners, I see all the places where I stumble and bump along in the path. My natural proclivity is closely associated with Bhakti Yoga, kind of a devotional path. And one of my teachers, Catherine Sensei, is her path of awakening would be Karma Yoga, so very much the service path. And interestingly enough, in her astrological natal chart, her sun is conjunct with where my south node is. And I just kind of bring this in as we just use everything possible to understand ourselves and to fully awaken. So we even use astro-dharma, astrology and dharma combined. So yeah, I went through many years of depression and anxiety and mental health struggles in my 20s. And it wasn't until my teachers and their compassionate work with me for years and years and years that trained me to see that I'm not my conditioning.
Yeah. Okay.
That's the sign that I'm done.
Thanks, Mo. And then just a brief story for myself. So I have worked in the mental health and addictions field for 30 plus years, and with over 20 of that as the executive director of our agency that I worked at. And part of what I saw was how difficult it was for people who didn't have a sense of clear sense of values and a clear practice, how easily they could get as therapists could get bumped out of their center as things got tough. And especially, as I'm sure most of you are aware, in the past 8 or 9 years, we've had an opioid crisis. We've seen huge numbers of deaths, and in our small community has also been severely affected by that. And then when COVID came and all the pressures that fell on the health system, we saw our colleagues, both in our agency and outside, really struggling to try to hold a sense of how to continue to do the work, how to continue to have a sense of hopefulness and to feel grounded. Many people had to eventually quit, left the practice. And I was able to see that through the work that I've been able to do at the center, the training I've received, and having the practice, I was able to maintain a sense of centering and groundedness that allowed me to go through that. And it was out of that experience, Maureen and I witnessing how our colleagues were struggling, that we had the idea of if there was a way to bring some of what we're learning through Clear Sky into a practicum experience for other young workers, especially, it would help them to avoid some of the overload and burnout that we saw happening to our colleagues. So that's our presentation. Thank you very much. Sorry for the technical interruptions. And
Thank you. Thank you very much, Dean and Maureen. And so our last presentation, and maybe I'll need your help to get our, so the last presenter is online. So thank you very much, all of you, for your patience. And Dr. Mukherjee, I hope you're there, and we'll get you online as soon as possible.
Hi, yes, I'm here.
Okay, great. So the next presentation is titled Mountains, Rivers, the Great Wide Earth, Zen Buddhist Eco-Spiritual Praxis in the Era of the Climate Crisis. And our presenter is Dr. Siddesh Mukherjee, whose scholarship focuses on socially engaged Buddhism and environmental social work. He researches how Buddhist thinker activists have conceptualized and responded to social and environmental problems. He is committed to studying and teaching methods with which social workers may expand their role in responding to the global ecological crisis. Welcome, Dr. Mukherjee.
Thank you so much for the introduction. Could you let me know if you hear me well, please?
Yes, we can.
Okay.
And Dr. Mukherjee, you have about 20 minutes or so.
Yes, and on that note, I'm going to move rather quickly. First of all, hello from London, England. It's 9 o'clock here, so if I look tired, it's because I am, but it's a joy to be with you. So I'll just quickly share a short part, an abbreviated version of this presentation because our time is short. So I'll describe very briefly a study that involved 35 Zen Buddhist teachers in the United States. These teachers have, their work overlaps with social work activities as defined by the International Federation of Social Workers. So these are Zen Buddhist teachers who are lifelong practitioners of Zen Buddhism and also do things like direct practice social work, psychotherapy, systems level policy change, community-oriented social action, activism. So they're Zen Buddhist teachers, but they're doing social work activities. And so I'll briefly describe how their work relates to eco-spirituality, which is our topic. A few words about Zen. It's part of Mahayana Buddhism, one of the two main branches of Buddhism. It originated in China and then spread to Vietnam, Korea, Japan, and the West more recently. It emphasizes meditation, both on the cushion, sitting, and in daily life, in every aspect of lived life. And it also emphasizes non-duality and interconnectedness of self, other, and the world, and a non-conceptual experience of this non-duality. So experiencing the non-duality of the world, the interconnectedness of the world for oneself, not just thinking about it, but actually experiencing it through intensive practice. And here's a quote that I drew on for the title of this presentation. It's also a quote that my participants drew on quite often to describe their eco-spiritual visions, if we're calling them that. This is a quote by the 13th century Zen master Eihei Dogen. It's one that I consider particularly beautiful, so I'll read it out loud. I came to realize clearly that the mind is not other than mountains, rivers, the great wide earth, sun, moon, stars. I'll read it one more time because I think it exemplifies what we're looking at. I came to realize clearly that the mind is not other than mountains, rivers, the great wide earth, sun, moon, stars. And so here are some of the questions that my study was asking. How do Zen Buddhist teachers who respond to suffering understand their experience, understand their relationship to other beings in the world? How does this guide their responses to suffering? And how does this relate to social work theory, especially our person and environment perspective and our understanding of practice as well? So I won't talk about all of the findings. The study generated a variety of breadth and a depth of findings, but I'll talk about the ones that relate to eco-spirituality. So some of the inclusion criteria for the study: Zen teachers whose work overlaps with social work, who live in the United States. And some of the interview questions, which I'll skip, I'll just display them very briefly. If you could just read through them in the interest of time, I'll keep them up here for 18 seconds, and then I'll move to the next slide. And so here are some of the findings from the study, from this grounded theory. It's a social constructionist grounded theory study with 35 Zen Buddhist teachers. And the findings relate to eco-spirituality on the micro, meso, and macro levels. So on the micro level, teachers in the study, participants of the study, bear witness to ecological suffering, both in themselves, in others, the people whom they serve as teachers, and in their communities. And so I'll share a poignant example of what I'm talking about. Just give me 1 second to make this a bit larger for accessibility reasons. And I'll read this out loud. So this is from the participant. You know, I sit with this idea that in the pain of the earth, there's a particular word, diminishment, I could say. An agroecologist here did a talk on a line from a Robert Frost poem, what to make of diminished thing, what to make of a diminished thing. And I just feel like we're seeing it everywhere right now. It's really obvious. Forests are losing their wildflowers. I went snorkeling in Puget Sound after a couple of decades of not doing it, and there was almost nothing under the water. What have there been? Something like 21 gray whales that have come ashore on the West Coast because they're starving? I mean, this is a diminished thing. This is a diminished world. Maybe we will see finally that we have to recognize their interconnection. And my response at the time was, I have no words. Participant, no words. One of the things I noticed when I was reviewing some of Joanna Macy's stuff, for many years, she always said, we won't know whether we're doing hospice work or midwifery. Now she says we're doing hospice work. But that's sacred work, right? Dying is as much an expression of Buddha nature as anything else. And maybe that's true. Maybe we're doing hospice work for a species and for all the other species in the world. And maybe there's a way to do that as bodhisattvas. I don't know. We can try. We can do this together. So in this example, this is one of my interviewees sharing her experience of bearing witness to her own pain, and also the pain of those around her, of those in her community, and the pain of other species as well. So bearing witness is a concept that's very important in Zen Buddhism. It means that you're not trying to necessarily manipulate an experience or even change it. You're there fully, openly to the experience as it is. Oftentimes painful experiences, but you're there fully bearing witness to it as it unfolds. On the meso level, participants talked about establishing Zen communities as islands of sanity in the era of the climate crisis. So these are places that people can go to both restore their sanity and also to enact sanity, to act in ways that are more sane from an ecocentric perspective, from an ecological perspective. And I'll share another excerpt from an interviewee to exemplify that. As you know, only the mind divides me and quote unquote the others, me and quote unquote world outside. And when we practice Zen, we let go of that ego, that self, and let the true nature, the true mind manifest by itself. In that state, there is no division, no boundary between quote unquote me and quote unquote others. Also, the me, the self, disappears. In that way, in our monastery, we have Tuesday every week, namely the silent day. That is the practice day. We just relax. We may walk down the hill, enjoy the presence of the deer, the wild rabbits, the birds, many kinds of birds. Then we find ourselves in nature, merge ourselves with nature. And so we find that the responsibility to keep the environment, to keep nature, to conserve it is necessary. And we vow that even we are going to construct the building, but I vowed to the wildlife around us that I will save an area for them on the hill. I would want the deer, the rabbits, the squirrel, many kinds of wildlife to live happily, joyfully in our area. And then the final idea that I'll share for now is participating in consciousness changing efforts toward a more ecocentric way of being. So this means educating other Buddhists, especially people who show up for practice in Zen Buddhist communities, and also using media, people writing articles, writing books, op-eds about more ecocentric ways of being that are grounded in a Buddhist worldview. For example, a lot of my work is focused on arguing that merely individual responses to suffering are insufficient, that we have institutional sources of suffering that Buddhism traditionally hasn't had much to say about. I think we have to look at that now, and what the ecological crisis brings to the fore is that this is not just a matter of human beings suffering, but also that we are causing the suffering of many other species, both individually and causing massive extinction events. I think all of these are related but differentiable types of suffering. And I think that we have to look at and respond to all of them. Buddhist practitioners have that responsibility, in my opinion. So we see that part of the eco-spiritual praxis that came up in my findings is reframing what it means to be a Buddhist, so that it's not about individual salvation. It's also about action towards systemic change, and even on the global level, toward a more ecocentric way of living. So I would like to use the rest of my time. I was told I have 15 more minutes, and I would love to have a dialogue because that's my favorite part. That's why I sign up for the presentations, is to meet people and listen to people and respond. So I would just love to hear from other folks now. If you have questions, I know that I flew through everything. So I'd love to hear from folks.
Hey, any questions? I do have to say, Dr. Mukherjee, as I was listening and watching your presentation, and I felt like you must have interviewed someone from Maureen and Dean's Retreat Center, because there was so much overlap. And then also what you said about interconnection, like all the presentations up until now, like there's of course the theme of spirituality and social work, but just that connection, I feel there's such a big undercurrent of that, which is really heartening for me individually and as a social worker, that there's good work that's being done.
Yeah, thank you so much. And I also appreciated the areas of overlap, and it does feel wonderful to hear words like interconnection and compassion become more part of the social work conversation.
Absolutely. Any questions, any thoughts?
Hello, Dr. Mukherjee. Thank you very much. I'd have loved to have heard more of that. I was really struck by the comment or the phrase "islands of sanity," and that's something we've thought about Clear Sky as well. That as we see the world becoming more fragmented, people becoming more fragmented, we think back to the in Europe, the monasteries during the Middle Ages and the Dark Ages being sort of islands of sanity and learning that kept culture together. And I think as we move forward into whatever challenges we're going to be facing, the Buddhist communities are going to be islands of sanity, particularly with the view that we need to move beyond our own ego focus and look at the broader realm of suffering and how to address that. So appreciate you pointing that out.
Thank you.
Holly?
Yes, go ahead.
Oh, sorry. Hello, and I'm also joining from the UK. I wanted to ask you about your participant statement who talked about we are doing hospice work for our species and other species. I thought that was so profound. And I wondered, going a little deeper into that comment, what you thought the potential of it was, because I see end of life work as ultimately about growth work. And I just wondered if you could expand on that idea, because it really is very powerful.
Yeah, thank you so much, Holly. And it's good to see you. I think we might have crossed paths very briefly in the past. It's nice to see you. And thank you for pointing out that comment. It's one that had an impact on me in the moment and continues to have an impact on me. In the context of this study, and I think that the implications go beyond the context of the study, like you were pointing out, but in that moment, I can share a bit about where that conversation was coming from, and I think what it was pointing to. The participant was sharing that in the course of environmental action or social action, it often feels like things are hopeless, that we're moving toward an inevitable and very difficult end. And at the same time, that doesn't necessarily need to change our impulse to act. We can still act. We can still act with energy, with compassion, with love, even though our actions might not save a thing. And I think this points to a very Zen perspective that while outcome can be important, also the action itself is important. And the relationship to hospice work, if a person is at the end of life, being there with that person won't save that person's life, but the act itself is incredibly important. And for reasons that I couldn't even begin to start to explain in a short amount of time, but I think that we all can appreciate. So I'm not sure if that responds adequately to your question, but hopefully it's on.
Thank you. It's wonderful. Thank you. I really appreciate you. I'll let someone else ask a question.
I'd like to make a comment in a similar vein. A very close friend of mine, Stephen Buhner, who himself died about 6 months ago. He is a well-known practitioner of sacred plant medicine. He wrote a book not long ago about earth grief, in which he was exploring very deeply, not only from a physical and biological sense, ecological disasters and impending major disasters that are going to be becoming worse, how to really be in touch with grief, one's own grief around that, the grief of communities, the grief of Earth itself, the grief of particular plants and animals, and rather than trying to sidestep it or diminish it, to really go into it deeply, and out of that come to a continued sense of commitment and compassionate response, even though you don't know what's going to come out of it in the sense of ego-based control. And he had a parallel process between his exploration of earth grief and his own dying process. And I was blessed to be part of the end of lifetime for him. And so it was very profound for me going through that with him as well. So some of you might be interested in the work of Stephen Buhner along those lines. And his latest book he finished just before he died, literally just before, is looking at how he came to the path of sacred plant medicine in an experiential standpoint.
Thank you so much, Ed, for sharing that. Would you be willing to put his name in the chat so I could look?
Yeah, that's a good idea. I shall do that.
Thank you so much for sharing that.
You're welcome.
Hey, well, I think that draws our day one to a close. And I just have to thank you all, the presenters and the delegates, the participants, because this is such a reminder for us to ground ourselves and be intentional in the work that we do as practitioners, as scholars, as individuals, and that theme of interconnection. We're so connected to the planet. And as Master Tulsi Shen said this morning, like, you know, this is Mother Earth. And I think all our cultures, indigenous cultures, talk about that. And over time, we've somehow lost touch with that at times. So this is a great reminder. And I also look at something that came up in another session was the rage that is being felt by youth because of the loss of what we've done to this planet. But I also think of the rage that is felt when we talk about racial trauma. And a lot of times that gets hidden under sadness, grief, and addictions. And we don't really, and I feel it's time that a lot of us have been able to actually express that rage, and especially when we're in practice and when we're working with clients. And I especially see that is that clients who are racialized and they see me as a person of color, they will express that so much more openly than they would with, you know, with a counselor, with a therapist who is not of color. So I think there's so many learnings and also creation of safety, whether it is for ourselves as practitioners, whether it is for the communities that we serve, and then also for the planet that we live on, that we call home. So I'm just going to wrap up with saying that take care of yourselves. Today's been a long day, a heavy day in some ways. So that self-compassion, self-care, moving with intentionality and mindfulness, all these wonderful things that we hear often about, but we forget to practice sometimes. So have a good evening, and thank you all online folks. Thank you so much for sticking around and for your patience.
Thank you.
Bye-bye. Thank you.